do I have everyone's permission to record? Our hope is to post these videos on D.I.V.A's YouTube channel. Names will be anonymous. We have an option to blur everything. So just message me privately if you are not comfortable with the meeting being recorded, and I'll make sure that I talk to you about that and that your identity is not shown on our YouTube videos. I would also love all of our audience members can please place their pronouns in their name. You just click on participants yourself, click rename, and then you can add your pronouns. We want to make sure that when we refer to you, we are calling you by the correct pronouns. So hi everyone, welcome to the second series in D.I.V.A's Cultural Appropriation series. We'll be talking about Asian American cultural appropriation today. In September, we'll be talking about Latinx cultural appropriation. In October, we'll be talking about Indigenous cultural appropriation. And we'll be ending our series in November, where we'll be covering Pacific Islander cultural appropriation. Please make sure to stay in contact with us. Our Instagram is diva_SLC, and my email is divaslc123@gmail.com. If you also Google the acronym DIVA or Google Diversity, Inclusion, Values, Action, you'll see our Google profile. There's a phone number and a bunch of information on there. So please stay in contact. My name is Janessa Jamo. I'm the founder and president of D.I.V.A. I actually started this forum through a workshop I was participating in. I was the youngest person in that workshop, and I was also the only Black person there. And I realized that I had an aptitude for engaging in difficult dialogues with people that were a lot different from me. I realized that Utah has a very unusual population where a lot of people grow up going to school with only 3 to 5 people of color, and that is experience that is abnormal. And so I want to create a brave space where we can call people in to ask questions that may not be comfortable asking in everyday settings, and to cover topics that are crucial for Utah's racial environment. I'm going to now pass the mic over to my board members who are present and let them have the time to introduce themselves.
Hello, you all. I'm Ayala Tarver. My pronouns are she, her, and Aya. I am the Director of Inclusivity and Equity, and I'm excited to be here. I'm happy that Janessa has provided this space for all my Utah folks, because I was born and raised in Salt Lake City, Utah, and a lot of these conversations we are holding in D.I.V.A space aren't talked about. So this is amazing. I'm happy to see you all here. Pass on to another member.
Hi, my name is Sonia. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the Director of Grassroots Action for D.I.V.A. I'm very excited to have this conversation in particular, but I'm also excited to work with other people and talk about and promote intersectionality in Utah, because I moved here when I was 15, and I was very shocked at kind of the same thing what Janessa was saying, like attending school with 3 to 5 people of color, things like that. So yeah, thank you to everyone who offered their time today, and for everyone who showed up to listen.
Hi, my name is Dion Saxby, she, her, hers. I am D.I.V.A's treasurer. And kind of just echoing what everybody else already said, thanks so much for attending this meeting, and I'm excited to see what we talk about.
I believe we have one more board member present. Bailey, if you'd like to introduce yourself. If not, no worries.
Hey, sorry, it's a little loud here. My son's just watching some shows. My name is Bailey Johnson, and I am the Chief Executive Officer for Mission and Advocacy. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm super happy to have everyone here at this meeting.
Adding on to that, D.I.V.A's mission is to educate, spread awareness, and create a brave space where people of diverse backgrounds can share their stories and broaden their life perspectives. So we're so happy to have you here today. We're now going to start this meeting with some recent news and awareness that has been occurring in Utah, as well as around the United States regarding critical race theory. So what is critical race theory? It's a body of legal scholarship and an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists in the United States that seek to critically examine US law as it intersects with issues of race and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice. So as you watch this video, I would like to interact with you audience members. I'm wondering if you are aware of this. How do you feel about this? What do you think this means for students of color? And I would just love for you to type in the chat if you haven't seen any of these interviews or if you have anything to say about it.
Happening this week, Utah Governor Spencer Cox is calling the Utah State Legislature into a special session, but one hot topic lawmakers in Washington are addressing will not be discussed in Utah. The governor declined to consider a ban on Utah schools discussing critical race theory. It focuses on racism being systematically built into American history and society.
In a new opinion piece in the Deseret News, Utah Congressman Chris Stewart says critical race theory rewrites history and should not be taught in any of Utah's schools. But Democratic social activist Darlene McDonald says the full story of America is not being told.
It paints our founding fathers in the most negative light, saying, well, they didn't care about freedom. They didn't care about we, the people. All they cared about was slavery and a way to continue to have the practice of slavery. And it's just not true.
Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. Same way with George Washington. In fact, I believe the first 12 or 13 U.S. presidents were slave owners. Ulysses S. Grant was the last U.S. president who was a slave owner. So you have to tell that history.
One ethics studies professor at the University of Utah says critical race theory can be utilized in ways beyond schools. However, he says it would create new challenges for academic freedom.
I think the only way forward is to really sort of, grapple with these issues and really kind of come to a deeper understanding that's informed by facts. So there's no foregone conclusion, right? We can always kind of come to our own sort of judgments about what's the lesson here to be learned. That if we don't really even sort of consider it or grapple it with it, then we're just going to kind of repeat history.
Last week, Governor Cox said there are several aspects of critical race theory he disagrees with and said it would, quote, not be taught in Utah schools.
The State Board of Education released a statement today saying that no board member has raised critical race theory as an agenda item to include in Utah's K-12 schools. Rather, there has been a focus on educational equity and access to learning for all students.
So I would love to know any of y'all's opinions on this. If you knew that this was happening in Utah, and if you think it is important for us to talk about critical race theory in our schools, just interact with us in the chat. We are going to move on to the next slide.
Happening this week, Utah Governor.
Okay. Also along the lines of awareness is the StopAPIHate foundation that was founded in the Bay Area of California and a lot of other organizations as well. It's a coalition that tracks, responds, gives awareness to incidents of hate, violence, harassment, discrimination, shunning, and child bullying against Asian Americans and the Pacific Islanders in the United States. It launched not too long ago, March 20th, 2020, in response to the rise of hate crimes towards Asian Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still currently happening. We see a lot of this occurring due to the past administration of the United States with Trump, and how that has deeply affected the Asian communities, especially in the Bay Area. Going to school in the Bay Area, I am very deeply aware of this. I'm going to pass it on to Emilio. He's very passionate about this.
Yes, and so although the historic and structural violence against both Asians and Pacific Islanders do exist, right? They are racialized as two separate categories in the US. And so over the past 2 years, the two groups have had very different experiences. So Asians experiencing xenophobia and bigotry as a result of the previous presidential administration's public perception of the virus, while Pacific Islanders experiencing the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic in states where Pacific Islander populations do exist, including in Utah, where Pacific Islander communities are the ones with the highest rate of infection and hospitalization due to the erasure of the needs in the public health system. So, our message here is just stating the fact that for many, Asian and Pacific Islander community organizations nationwide and locally, including PI communities and organizations and leaders in Utah, that our focus today is Stop Asian Hate, and that APIA, AAPI, PIAA doesn't always mean Asian and Pacific Islander. And so for today's discussion of Asian American cultural appropriation, that Stop Asian Hate Crimes is the focus, although we do know that StopAPIHate does exist. And including within that, I just wanted to comment on the previous, the slide for CRT. Our organization, OCA, or OCA, Asian Pacific Islander American Advocates Utah, which I'll talk about later, was actually working with Senator Jani Iwamoto and Representative Karen Kwan in earlier this year during that special session when the CRT was happening, to introduce this concurrent resolution to acknowledge that within the state of Utah, we should be celebrating Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, but also recognizing that our histories here have not always been the friendliest, that our people here, different ethnic groups, have not always been welcome. And this was right before, and it passed unanimously in both the House and the Senate in the state of Utah. But right after us, they talked about critical race theory, and that's when they're like, yeah, no critical race theory in schools. And we're like, well, you just passed acknowledging our thing and it contradicts, so it's messy, is what I'll leave it to that point. So thank you, Mayala.
Also, just to leave us on a note, the common myth and wrongful message that's spread in the media is that BIPOC communities are supposed to go against each other when they start their own movements and start talking and fighting against their oppression, and that is wrong. Stop AAPI and Stop Asian Hate collabs with other BIPOC communities, specifically with the Black Lives Matter movement and other things like that. They recognize that in order to effectively address anti-Asian racism, we all must work together to end all forms of structural racism leveled at BIPOC communities, and also our queer folks as well.
So now we'll be introducing our guest speakers for today. Milo will start.
Right. So I'm going to introduce Irene Maya Ota. She is she's really a close family friend of mine that I was happy to invite and recruit onto this. She was a past and retired professor at the University of Utah, and she has a lot of other great licenses and a lot of passion and work with social justice, and specifically with a lot of cultural stuff as well. We also have Diana Hiroshivi, I hope I said that and pronounced that right, who is from Boise, Idaho, and she's going to give us a perspective with her mixed identity with being full Asian that's often not recognized with the distinction, which we'll talk about as well.
And I will be introducing Yeo Huang. And I'm just going to introduce their names and have them introduce themselves. So I'll also be introducing Jeremy Lamb, and I'll let Sonia follow at the end with her guest speaker. If Yeo and Jeremy want to speak and talk about their backgrounds, this is the moment too.
Hi, I'm Yeo. I am a Vietnamese American and my pronouns are she, her. I'm currently a third year at the University of Utah. Cultural appropriation is one of the topics I'm very passionate about. I've done a lot of presentations and some research on Asian cultural appropriation, so that's why I'm super excited and honored to be here to talk about this.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeremy Lamb. I use he, they pronouns. I am primary focus of my research is Asian American oppression and issues and the political frameworks that surround those things. So I'm happy to be here and I'm excited to have this discussion with y'all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diana Khosrovi. I'm originally from Boise, Idaho. I wanted to thank you all for joining today. I am half Korean, half Iranian, and I feel really passionate about a lot of social justice advocacy, and I experienced a lot of micro and macro aggressions growing up, which is why I felt the need to come and essentially share my perspective. And I try to really do take up a lot of space because I think the prevailing idea in a lot of Asian communities is keep your head down, do the work, and don't create noise. And so I'm like, that's not happening for me. Like, I am here to take up space and create noise. So yeah, I relocated to Salt Lake City to come to Westminster and attend school there. I graduated with an honors Bachelor of Science in Public Health and an emphasis in philosophy. And then I also had the unique opportunity to study abroad in Seoul, South Korea at Korea University, which is where I kind of learned about the intersection between public health, government, and ethics. And now I work in the media and journalism industry, but I also do, as I said, a lot of social justice advocacy as well. So yeah, thank you for having me here today to talk.
So this is Irene, she, her, hers. I have lived in Utah since I was 2, but I grew up in Japantown when there was a Japantown, and it wasn't just one block like it is now. What Utah or Salt Lake City likes to say is Japantown. That's not what it was. I worked 40 years at the University of Utah. I taught 20 of those years, a little over 20 years. I taught diversity and social justice classes, and my education focused on white identity formation. And I'm ABD in a PhD program, and that means all but dissertation, and I'm not writing that anymore, I'm retired. But my research interest was critical space theory and how it impacted identity formation.
And then if Sonia wants to introduce her guest speaker.
Okay, so then Emilio Manuel Camus will introduce his background himself. I found him because he works with the OAC Utah. So Emilio, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, mabuhay everyone. I'm Emilio Manuel Camus, Kurt Tagalog Bicol non-Filipino immigrant and first-gen graduate from the U of U. I did my bachelor's in communication, but also in Asian Pacific Islander studies, and eventually got my master's in educational leadership and policy. And the U is actually where I met Irene. Hi, Irene. So we've known each other now for the past 11 years because my community involvement started out in 2010, my first year of college, when I joined the Asian American Student Association and the Pacific Islander Student Association up there. So for the past 11 years, ever since, I've just been serving on different boards and leadership for different Asian and Pacific Islander community organizations, both in Salt Lake, in the state, and then nationally. By trying to continue the legacies that my predecessors have left for me. Both of my grandparents, paternally and maternally, were involved in community organizing in the Philippines. And then my parents, not so much. They were too focused on, getting us here, migrating here. I was born in the Philippines, but moved here 2001. So celebrating, I guess, 20 years of being in the diaspora with family. And excited to be here, primarily involved with OCA Asian Pacific Islander American Advocates Utah. We are the state chapter for the National Civil Rights and Advocacy Organization, focusing on our state's 150,000 Asians and Pacific Islanders, dedicated to our social, political, and economic success.
We're so excited to have you all here today.
So we're going to start off with definitions of terms that are constantly going to be talked about throughout the presentation. So what is culture? Culture is defined as the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. We all come from different positionalities, social locations, racial and ethnic backgrounds that hold truths and stories. And in this space, we are opening the floor to our Asian identifying friends to talk about their culture and experiences with their culture in and outside of the United States. And we hope all of you can learn, grow, and broaden your awareness, but most of all, respect all of these folks' lives, because our culture is our life socialized, and a lot of the stuff these people are going to be talking about hold trauma, hold exhaustion, and hold just authenticity. So just respect their space, please.
Cultural appropriation is defined as the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas, etc. of one people or society by members of another, and typically more dominant people or society. I believe you have a little part on this.
Yeah. Appropriation causes harm when it perpetuates stereotypes, turns culture into a commodity or comedy, uses historical traditions as a trend, while the originating group continues to experience oppression and discrimination for the very same thing that's appropriated by a dominant group. So if any of you guys or any of you all attended our first conversation on this D.I.V.A series, you got a glimpse of one of the most popular forms of cultural appropriation seen in the mainstream media today, with the appropriation of Black culture, from shoes to hairstyles, beauty features, skin color, etc. And now you're going to be introduced to or become more familiar with the acts of appropriation in Asian and Asian American culture. This act of adoption is invisibly normal in American culture, and most of us don't even acknowledge or notice acts of cultural appropriation happening in our vicinity all the time. So in this space and conversation, we hope you and invite you to open your eyes, think back to the time you may have appropriated or have seen an act of cultural appropriation occur in your lifetime. For those of you who are new to this term and act, the next slide will enlighten what appropriation is in a binary distinguished from cultural appreciation.
All right, so we're going to talk about the distinction between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation.
I've always wanted to do that. Next round on me.
I would describe cultural appropriation as taking something that has cultural, spiritual significance and stealing from it.
Cultural appropriation to me is when you make it a costume and it's not coming from an authentic, genuine place.
Something from a culture is being used without reference. Cultural appropriation in my own culture, being a Black woman, my hair was definitely quite a hot topic. It only took people or celebrities of a certain color to make these hairstyles almost seem respectable or seem trendy. That for me was kind of like an insult.
There was a phase where everyone wore keffiyehs, not really realizing what a keffiyeh was in any way, which is like a traditional like Palestinian scarf, associations with like political lines, and it became like a wider fashion thing.
When I see artists diving into Chinese culture and I kind of using it in a way where, is this anything to do with your narrative? Is this just merely an accessory, a trend to your work? That's when I feel it's getting a bit inappropriate.
You can't just like pick and choose what you think is cool from their cultures and use it to make money.
Call out culture is a bit crazy, so if you're not careful, you might get caught slipping.
Cultural appreciation is when you actually like work with the people from the culture that you're like taking something from.
I'm inspired by this and I also want to contribute to this culture as well.
The type of model high fashion brands use in their campaigns indicate who their target market is.
You're very like inspired by, say, Moroccan culture. Put a North African model in your clothes.
Good example of somebody doing it right is Fenty. Bella Hadid came out in like a yellow lingerie, there was like a headdress kind of reminiscent of a hijab. The fact that she used the Palestinian model reflects the lack of backlash.
There are already so many people doing whatever you want to do, and they will do it 10 times better than you can.
Big fashion brands can avoid having these types of backlash when they get people from the culture to consult. I don't feel like there's actual need for another person that isn't part of my culture to now go and represent. Just let the people that are actually of the culture talk.
It'd be so easy for brands to give these people like a platform and a voice and say, we really appreciate your artisanal skills, like hire them to make the garments.
So if you take an inspiration from a certain culture, make sure that everyone knows the story of where it came from, how it came about.
A small interview, just giving credit towards that, I think makes the whole difference. What I feel like makes people so angry when, you're not really acknowledging what its actual roots are.
How did you make this a space that is more about them as well? Because a culture doesn't exist without its people.
So I love that video. And one question that I would love for us to talk about is when appropriating a culture, do you express current feelings of prejudice, racism, isms in general towards the BIPOC group and minority marginalized community in general? And so in the last meeting, we actually had somebody who was half Pacific Islander, half Nicaraguan, who has thick curly hair, and was asking us, if she's getting her hair done at a Black-owned business and actually has the texture to wear box braids, does that count as cultural appropriation? And so what we thought as the guest speakers and as members of D.I.V.A is that, and asked her, in your community, are there people surrounding you that use the N-word or who do offensive things to the Black community, and do you actively speak out against that? Because you can't appropriate a culture and not be doing the work behind it to appreciate it and to make sure that you are appropriating it in the right way. So that's something that I would love for everyone to kind of just think on, is if you are appropriating culture, if you are wearing clothes or doing your makeup in a way that is special to one's culture, are you also actively creating solidarity and speaking up when you hear something offensive towards that community?
I would describe cultural appropriation.
Okay, what is anti-blackness?
So in this space, it's only right for us to talk about anti-Blackness and whiteness and otherness. That's the whole purpose of D.I.V.A, is for us to create conversations that speak out against the underlying institutions that are affecting and cross and intersect with other acts of oppression like cultural appropriation. With the video right here, it's going to give a quick definition of anti-Blackness, and then we'll go into whiteness and have a couple of our speakers pitch in when needed.
My language, my choice. Words mean things. Anti-Blackness. Ta-Nehisi Coates defines racism as the need to ascribe bone-deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them. Race, a social, political, cultural, and economic construct, was designed to create hierarchies of domination and subordination. The false narratives of intelligence, worth, who deserves dignity and humanity are predicated on who has access to power. Anti-Blackness is desiring features of Blackness and Black cultural artifacts such as clothes, speech, hairstyles, and music without seeing the humanity of Black people.
Brought to you by Pacific Lutheran University and the Office of Diversity, Justice, and Sustainability.
Is there more to the video?
Yeah, that's the video. All right. Then what is whiteness? That easily displays anti-Blackness and otherness towards other BIPOC groups. So general definition, whiteness refers to the construction of the white race, white culture, and the system of privileges and advantages afforded to white people in the US and across the globe through government policies, media portrayal, decision-making power with our corporations, schools, judicial systems, etc. I'm gonna give a quote from Nell Irvin Palmer that kind of just tackles whiteness. Whiteness is on a toggle switch between bland nothingness and racist hatred. There's a binary within whiteness that easily displays white fragility, white privilege, white supremacy, white tears, color blindness, and that's easily displayed all the time in usual spaces like D.I.V.A gives. And you guys got to respect and understand what the brutality of whiteness is for our white identifying folks, and how you need to understand your place when it comes to this space. And I would love for Irene to talk a little bit about whiteness as well.
Well, that's a pretty good definition. But so whiteness is not just your phenotype, right? Whiteness has been very complex from the beginning of racialized identities. Back before 1920, we actually only had 3 categories of race, and that was Negroid, Mongoloid, and Caucasoid. And then in the 1920s, we had this massive immigration from Europe, but Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, not from Northern Europe, particularly the English, who are our colonizers. And because these countries were colonized by England, they didn't want them to be identified as fully white, because that would then take the privileges that the Northern English had created for themselves in the United States, in their colony of the United States. And so that's why the Irish were considered not quite white, and the Italians not quite white, until they morphed into whiteness. And there's a book by, I can't remember his name, Jacobson is his last name, about how people morphed into whiteness, how Europeans morphed into whiteness. So it's much more. But now, since we have like 5 main categories of race, whiteness gets decided by phenotype. It's called master status, your phenotype. What do you look like? That's the first thing people will notice is, are you white or are you not white? And then they'll determine your whiteness, degree of whiteness, and your degree of being non-white. Like, what exactly are you if you're not white? But the first thing is you're just not white, and then the second thing is you're white, but what kind of whiteness? So my son-in-law is Bosnian. He immigrated from Bosnia, and he presents as white. His phenotype, his master status is white. But as soon as he opens his mouth and he has that accent, he's not quite white enough. So there are varying degrees of how whiteness is defined, and varying degrees of the privileges that are given to white people. And colorblindness actually is used to hide the institutional systems of oppression and the white privilege and the white supremacy that exists. So colorblindness is all about white fragility and white tears, to hide that this country was created for rich white men. From the very, very beginning, this country was colonized and created the power, what Ta-Nehisi Coates said, economic, social, cultural, all created for rich white men. Women were not considered, they were second-hand citizens, even white women. They were chattel, they belonged to their husbands or whatever. So, because women didn't get the right to vote until 1920, 200 years after we declared ourselves a country.
All right, and so to display everything that we have talked about in terms of whiteness, we're going to show a video dating back to an anti-racist white woman activist, Jane Elliott, who did tons of experience to to give people in classrooms that feeling of oppression and not having master status. You have to unmute, Janessa. There you go.
Perception is everything. White people look vicious and ugly and non-caring and cruel and arrogant and powerful and condescending and angry. Are you angry? No. Oh, good for you. Are you angry?
Trying not to.
Trying not to be. Now, does that take a lot of energy?
Yes.
Yes. Are you holding it in?
Yes.
Yes. And are you trying really, really hard not to react to me?
Yes.
Yes. And are you trying really hard not to look at me?
At the moment, yes.
Yes. Why?
Because I don't want to make myself more upset.
You don't want to make yourself more upset by looking at me.
Yes.
Right. Does that take a lot of time, a lot of energy?
Yes.
Yes. Is that hard for you?
Yes.
Could you develop an ulcer over this?
No.
If you had to do it every day, what would happen to your blood pressure?
It would rise.
Yeah. If somebody stood over you, you knew it was going to happen every day? Or you expected it to happen every day? Or it happened when you didn't expect it to? Or it happened to your kids every day? After it happened to your mother every day? Now, getting right along. Your hand is still up. You still didn't learn anything, did you? Didn't I just say when your hand is up, you are thinking of what you're going to say instead of what's being said? Didn't I just say that?
Yes, you did.
And did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
And did you decide that you were just going to do it your way?
I was.
Wait a minute, you're on a roll
Yes,
there for
I
a minute.
did.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I did.
Now, since you choose to not listen to others, what do you suppose we're going to do where you're concerned?
Well, listen to me.
Thank you very much.
May I
Now,
finish what I was saying?
no, because you're still thinking of what you're going to say instead of what I'm saying. Now, getting right along.
I heard what you were saying.
You're
I
doing it
understand
again.
What you were
You're
saying.
doing it again.
I don't care.
You're doing it
because
again.
It's wrong.
You're
You
doing it again.
Persecuted her for standing
You're
up.
doing it again.
Persecuted him for standing up. The only change that ever happens is when people stand out, and I have to stand back.
Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. Are you in any physical danger here? Are you in any physical danger here? Is that girl in any physical danger here? Emmett Till was hanged by his neck after he was beaten almost to death, simply because he made a statement to a white woman. Every time I do the exercise, there is a point at which I know I have.
If anybody has any thoughts and feelings from that video, I'd love for you to share. One thing that came to my mind, even though I 100% understand the point she's getting across, is that like there may be people in that room that have anxiety or who were verbally abused growing up, and like that could be very traumatic for them. But of course, this is a representation of what people of color have to go through every single day, and what their ancestors and grandparents and parents and children have to go through every single day. So although it may seem a little extreme, it is a very real experience for a lot of people of color. All right, what is othering and otherness?
Othering is a phenomenon in which some individuals or groups are defined and labeled as not fitting in within the norms of a social group. So when we tie into what's in between Blackness and whiteness, that binary that's constantly displayed throughout the world in terms of race and ethnicity, we kind of hide and disregard the other groups of color that are in between there. And so that's when otherness, the system of otherness is displayed, where it intervenes with how majority and minority identities are constructed, and it can be an us versus them way of thinking about human connections and relationships. And this does not only just affects majority white or versus people of color, but also in the racial and ethnic identities within itself, which will tie more when we talk about the distinction between Asian versus Asian American, and how othering is a way of negating another person's individual humanity based on other systems of oppression like colorism, gender, sexual orientation, religion, etc. All right, cross-cultural appropriation. I believe Yeo wanted to say something about this as well, but I'll just go ahead and define it. Cross-cultural appropriation occurs when someone, a part of an institutionalized community, takes part in offensive transgressions towards another. Yes, appropriation happens within minority groups. This is something that is not displayed and not talked about within BIPOC communities, that you can, as a person of color, appropriate another culture, regardless if it's another BIPOC group or whatnot. And in these pictures, you can see with Cardi B, she appropriated a Hindu-inspired magazine cover, and it was quite offensive towards people of those of Indian descent in the Asian community. Again, with Nicki Minaj appropriating Asian culture through traditional clothing, hairstyles, language, and her song Chun-Li, which is brought to our attention by our board member, Sonia. And Janessa, if you go ahead and click the spacebar. We also have Selena Gomez and Beyonce, both appropriating like a Bollywood style of traditional South Asian forehead art, as seen on Selena Gomez in her Come and Get It performance at the MTV Awards, or with Beyonce in her music video with another group of people in her music video as well. And Yeo, I think you wanted to say something as well with this.
Yeah, I do have a section on this in where I'm speaking later, but I just wanted to bring up where it's like, just because you are like a person of color yourself, like that doesn't mean you can't be racist either. Like being a minority does not give you immunity to behave in a racist way. And I think that's something that some people aren't aware of, or it's something they've never thought of before, or they just don't believe that just because we are already marginalized and we already like experience racism and microaggressions and macroaggressions, that we are exempt from doing harmful things to other communities. So that's also something good to keep in mind as well.
Thank you for bringing it up, Yo. It's so important. And I really dislike when people of color do have that mindset that like, because we have been oppressed, we cannot oppress other people of color, because it's like, if you're holding any type of biased thought in your mind, regardless of who it is, regardless of who you are, it's wrong. And I think a lot of people go back and forth about that, especially between BIPOC communities, because like we're all oppressed, so we can make jokes about other oppressed people. No, we're fighting for equity for everyone, not just for our community.
Yeah, another thing to talk about is the intersection of other identities. Like if you're coming from a different socioeconomic status from the norm, or even your gender and sexuality, that's another thing that's not talked about a lot in the BIPOC community. So that's another repression. So if you're over here saying homophobic words, transphobic words, speaking ableist, that also is a form of oppression. And we can't fight for equality if we're still actively oppressing and engaging with systems of oppression that are in place towards us.
So what is the distinction between a person that identifies as an Asian versus a person that identifies as an Asian American? So if a person identifies as an Asian, they were born, I think it was supposed to say born and raised outside of the US. I think these are switched. They're switched around right now. Asian Americans supposed to be at the top and Asians supposed to be at the bottom. So I'm just gonna read them switch. So if somebody identifies as Asian American, they were born and raised in the US. They may or may not speak their native language. They relate to the American social experience more than their culture's social experience. And if a person identifies as Asian, they were born in Asia. They speak their native language. They relate more to the social experience of their native culture and may struggle assimilating to American culture. Now I'm gonna open this up to our guest speakers to speak on their personal distinction and their experiences with their Asian identity in terms of this distinction.
Well, I'll go quickly. I believe that the dominant society also plays a part in how you identify, because you're navigating through a hostile, unfriendly environment who stereotypes you anyway. And so there's many times when I'm just identified as Asian by the dominant society because they do group and stereotype. I identify, even though I was born in Japan, I immigrated as a child, an infant. And I grew up in Japantown, but you can't escape the dominant culture. It surrounds you. It's in the air you breathe when you're living here, right? And you have to acculturate. You have to adapt. You have to gain some cultural capital in knowing how to navigate in a society that is not yours, that continues to other you, even though you're identified as Asian American. So I speak very little of my language. I understand a little bit more. Japanese was spoken in my house because my parents didn't speak English very well, but they wanted their children to learn English because we had to navigate not only for ourselves, but for them as well. So I think that being identifying as Asian or Asian American is very situational and circumstantial, and sometimes not always in our own control.
Yeah, I really wanted to echo what Irene was saying with circumstance. I think in my experience, it's been very unique to have a like a multicultural background and a background in which it's like half Korean, half Iranian, but also American. And so the running joke in my family is that I'm half Korean, half Iranian, half American. But when I go out into this American landscape, you know, I say that I'm half Korean, and the automatic assumption, because I don't fully, like, to them, they're like, oh, you don't look Korean, which itself is a problematic statement, which is, yeah. But they assume that my other half is white. And so when I say that I'm Iranian, I get two very different reactions to where they say, oh, that's confirmed, it is white, like Iranian is white, which it's not, it's Asian. But there's also the flip side of things where it's almost this erasure, or it's like a dismissal, and I'll talk about this more in my section of the presentation, but there it really becomes like this point in time where I'm not Korean enough, I'm not Iranian enough, I'm not American enough. So actually, when I was in junior high and high school, like those years, I had a really difficult time closing in on my identity and who exactly I am and how I should show up. So really, I've gone back and forth, and I've really struggled with, am I Asian or am I Asian American? Because again, like my American presence just more, my racial identity or my ethnic identity was never justified or was never verified in America. And I hate that I gave like the United States or like the people around me so much power to define that. But that was really something that I struggled with growing up. And so kind of as like, I don't want to say counterculture, but I kind of became like disgusted with the idea of like the Americanness just taking over me. And I wanted to hold on to my roots so badly. So that's my experience.
We have enough time for one more guest speaker to talk about their experience, if they'd like.
I can go real quick. So specifically for my experience, I would consider myself Asian American because I think it is the clashing between domestic and everything outside of your domestic sphere, those cultures individually, the fact that they're clashing inside a single person, I think, is what defines my Asian American experience, right? So while my culture inside the house was very, very Asian, right? We take off our shoes in the house. We always respect our elders. We you know, just a bunch of stuff like that that is not quote unquote normal in American culture. So I think that the struggle in grappling with those two is what makes me Asian American. Whereas I feel like if the culture I'm experiencing in my house is the same as everyone else's house, or even a majority of people's houses that live around me, right? Then I would consider that, then I would consider myself Asian. But the fact that the two conflict so much, and that I need to grapple with my sense of community and sense of belonging, I think is what creates is what makes me Asian American as opposed to Asian.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jeremy.
Oh, that's me. So as I was saying, I immigrated from Japan, but I immigrated as U.S. citizen. My mother was a nanny so I was born 7 years after the war. And when my mom was a teenager, she experienced the fire bombings of Japan, and she grew up in Tokyo. And after the war in occupied Japan, she was a nanny for a military officer. And so I was able to be born in a U.S. hospital, which made me born on U.S. soil. So I was an American citizen, and that's my passport. Look at that cute baby. And we and immigrated to Japan. But I want you to look at the number that's handwritten on my passport, 103. That's how many of us were not coming to America. That's how, I mean, so this was, yeah. Anyway, this is in the 50s. And so then the war and the anti-Japanese sentiment there, I guess, you know, whatever the circumstances, we were able to come over. Again, when I was 2, we moved to Salt Lake into Japantown because my parents didn't speak much English at that time. And Japantown was a magnet for immigrants, and because of segregation, discrimination, and hate during that time. Remember, it was 7 years after the war ended, and there was still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. And so that's Japantown. And again, Japantown was basically from 2nd South to North Temple, from 400 West to State Street. It was big. It had businesses, it had hotels, it had restaurants, we lived there. There were homes there, apartments in there. We lived right across the street from the Buddhist temple, the Salt Lake Buddhist temple, and just up the block from the Japanese Church of Christ. We were there, we lived there. So this one block, when they're trying to save Japantown, so to speak, it's a one block from 2nd West to 3rd West on 1st South. That is not Japantown. I get very upset when I keep hearing that they're going to recreate Japantown. They cannot, unless they take away the Salt Palace, where the jazz play. They got to get rid of all that. They got to get rid of all that and all the development from 2nd South to North Temple. And they're not going to do that. And they're building a huge hotel on the corner there that's going to make it impossible. So it's interesting that I'm an American citizen, because citizenship did give me a lot of privilege, having citizenship. My parents, my father was what they called Kibe, where he was born in the United States, but at the age of 3, he was sent back to Japan to get the proper education and upbringing. So my parents, so my father was a citizen. My mother was not until she was in her 60s. She couldn't take the citizenship test. She wasn't able to. And I think she cheated. She got her driver's license by cheating, because she couldn't read or write English, didn't understand it very well, but she had to drive, right? She had to drive. So anyway, any questions about Japantown? Nope, okay. Again, the colorblind ideology, I think we already talked about that. It used just to hide the historical oppression of people of color. The institutions, the laws, the policies, the goals of what America was, the United States of America was going to look like, what it was going to be. And it never included people of color, just never did. And so a colorblind ideology hides, is very useful in white fragility and white tears, hides white supremacy, and is actually very detrimental to people of color, because it just erases all of your history. It erases your identity. There was a video I saw where a young woman, she was indigenous, she said, "You're asking me to leave the best part of me at the door when I walk into a room." Asian as a monolith, again, people think Asians are Asians are Asians. And I think Emilio spoke to this, that we are so complex. There are so many different kinds of Asians, but dominant society, American society, actually has in mind a certain phenotype, right? Certain eye shapes, being short, certain hair color, certain hair texture, etc., and a certain geography from where you come from. That's typically how they identify Asians, but Asians are very complex. Even if you went to Japan, the Japanese are very complex. They're not all the same. The cultures aren't the same in Japan. And my parents coming from post-war Japan in the 50s, where it was still occupied, came with a certain kind of culture and understanding that no longer exists in Japan. To be Japanese now is different from being Japanese when my parents were living in Japan. My parents went back to Japan in the 80s, I think, for the first time. So we immigrated in the 50s and my parents went back in the 80s. So 30 years after, my mother came back, she said, "Oh, I can't live there anymore. It's so different." And she, she grew up there. There's a book by Mia Tuan, Forever Foreign or Honorary White. Again, when we talk about who's Asian American, what's your identity? An Asian phenotype, an Asian understanding by the dominant society will say you are foreign. You are foreign before you are American. I don't know how many of you were asked if you spoke English. I remember a situation where someone was panhandling, right, and asking people for money. And when she got to me, she first asked me if I spoke English because she wanted to make sure that I knew she was asking me for money. And I can be snarky sometimes. And what I said was, "No, I'm sorry, I don't speak." Walked away. So this forever foreign and honorary whiteness refers to the model minority stereotype, which I think we're going to discuss later on. So the model minority stereotype sort of makes you an honorary white because you're so, what Diana, were you saying? That you're quiet, you're complacent, you get along, you don't cause, you don't rock the boat. And why wouldn't the dominant culture want that in a foreigner, right? Why wouldn't they want that? But there's something called triangulation that they do with Asians. So what white society does is they use the model minority stereotype to pit people of color against each other. Look, you African Americans, look how the Asians pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and are doing well, right? They're honorary whites. They don't say honorary white, but that's what they mean. Look, you Latinx people, why can't you be more like Asians? Look how they pulled themselves out of their bootstraps, et cetera, et cetera. And so that they pit each other against each other, right? And so that there's resentment and anti-Asian feelings, which we see now against Asian. Is there anything else? Any questions? Any additional comments?
I think it's important for audience members to think back to a time you may have been frustrated or have had thoughts in your mind when you're engaging with somebody who has less fluent English spoken from a quote unquote foreign person? And what were those feelings? And like, where do you think those feelings are coming from? Because this happens all the time. You could go to a BIPOC owned business and they do not speak English as fluent as you do yourself, but you may be having thoughts like, oh my gosh, hurry up. Like I got places to go, or like that right there is a microaggression. That right there is already showing anti-Asian, anti-Black feelings towards that person. Just simple things like that. Keep those in mind, and we're gonna open the floor at the end and even right now for you to speak and ask questions about this.
So what I find interesting about that too is that it gets recentered and onto self. So white Americans, when they hear someone talking in their own cultural language, will often feel like they're talking about them, right? They recenter it. And so they want to know what they're talking about because they think they're talking about them. People aren't talking about them. It's just not, they're conversing with each other, right? They're conversing with each other. They're not talking about you. Well, maybe they might be, I don't know, but it's probably not their main focus of conversation. Thus, Claire Kim, founder of triangulation theory.
There's going to be a lot of questions and like resources in chat that we want you guys to start writing down or start looking up, because we're only here to educate with you in this space, but this is our life. This is tiring. We can't keep doing this. So take hold of this privilege in this space to like look at these resources.
So this is about cultural appropriation here, and you can see that the kimono is used to hypersexualize the female body. Who is that? That person with the chopstick? Well, they all have chopsticks in their hair. We eat with chopsticks. We wouldn't put them in our hair. We wouldn't do that. And I think that's kanji on that person's arm. And kanji is very interesting because it's open to interpretation. When it, like, what kanji is next to what kanji, that changes the meaning entirely. So a kanji that stands alone would mean something different when it's paired with other kanji. And I remember I had a student who was named Kimiko. She was white and her parents named her Kimiko. Her parents white. I guess they were enamored with the name Kimiko, and she wanted a tattoo of her name. And I said, well, do you want hiragana or do you want kanji? Which do you want? And she said she didn't know the difference. Hiragana is the alphabet that's phonetical. So it would tell you the word. It wouldn't tell you necessarily the meaning, right? So it'd be kimiko, there'd be 3, kimiko. The kanji is 2 kanjis, and it means child of the wind, right? Child of the wind spirit. And so I said, well, you know, the kanji is child, but it was only 2. She wanted the longer one, the 3. I was trying to educate her, and it was fruitless. It was just fruitless. So our understanding, the dominant culture's understanding of kanji, I don't think people even know the difference, that there are 3 ways of writing. There's katakana, hiragana, and kanji. And they're different. They're different. But I don't think people understand that. And I had a coworker once come and show me a tattoo they got and said, this doesn't mean what I wanted it to mean. Can you fix it? And I'm like, no, I don't know. I don't know kanji. It's too hard for me, but he wanted me to fix it by writing the correct thing. Well, you shouldn't have got that if you have no idea what you're putting on your body.
So Emily in our audience says, something I see a lot from vintage and secondhand clothing sellers in Salt Lake City, which are majority white women, is selling of robes/shirts with the label of kimono. I'm not aware if the items are actually a traditional kimono, but could you please speak on how to navigate that call them in, stop supporting their businesses because they don't understand the appropriation.
Stop those businesses? I don't think you can stop them because people will buy them. I think you can speak. There's always the power of speaking and saying, this is not a kimono, this is maybe a kimono style robe. Whatever they're wearing is not a kimono. Kimonos are quite beautiful, and they're constructed in a very specific way. And when you wrap a kimono, if you do it the wrong way, so if you wrap it, I think you got to wrap it left and then right, because if you do right and left, that means you're being buried because you're dead and you're at your own funeral. And so, how many people know that, right? And so, but these what we're seeing here are not kimonos. In fact, the red short mini one looks like a combination of Asian styles. It's, yeah. So yeah, you can speak and you can tell people. I don't know if you have enough power to stop them, and most people don't care. Like the one young woman who wore the Chinese dress, right? Which I think Jeremy is going to speak to, but she said, oh, it's just a dress, right? She said it's just an effing dress, but no, it's not just an effing dress. It has meaning, historical meaning and cultural meaning. So that's cultural appropriation, not understanding, not acknowledging, not respecting, not embracing, not celebrating, just taking. And I don't know if you want me to talk about that now, that the emails I got from people when I spoke on cultural appropriation and how I was told that I was wrong and that as a white male, because they did identify themselves as white male, that they had a right to take anything they wanted from any culture. That's a colonizer speaking right there.
When we watch the video, I would definitely like for you to talk about the emails you received.
Okay. Oh, and food in general, cultural food outside of what Americans know as American food, which is what, hamburgers? I don't know. But the way that that food is presented, particularly Japanese cuisine, is presented in America is changed and altered for American palates. It is not true Japanese cuisine. So you see on the well, it's my left with the salmon and the miso and the rice. I was going to say go on the rice. That's breakfast. That's a Japanese breakfast. I don't know if people know that, but that is a Japanese breakfast, and it's served in small bowls and small. And American palates are like, let's just pile everything up. Right? At my house, sometimes I'll do a hand roll sushi party, and I tell them you cannot just pile things on a piece of seaweed and rice. Like, pick carefully, consciously. Pick flavors that you think will go together. Don't put more than I would say 3 items on your sushi roll so you can enjoy the taste. But so that reminds me of sushi burrito, right? Sushi burrito is this huge, gigantic thing with lots and lots of things stuffed in. That's for the American palate. That is not sushi. And sushi does not mean raw fish. Sushi is the seasoned rice made for these kind of, it's like saying pizza, right? There's not just one kind of pizza. Pizza is not just pepperoni and tomato sauce. And pizza we get here is not the pizza they serve in Italy. And so what the Japanese cuisine we get here is modified. I think I was talking about going to a Chinese restaurant, one that I like a lot and I go to. I went with a Chinese friend, and they gave her a completely different menu than what I was used to getting, because I was not Chinese. And they had more authentic dishes on there, like jellyfish, right? That they wouldn't put on an Americanized menu. So people have to understand that we we are not. In America, it's very difficult to find authentic Japanese food. It's very difficult. I miss my mother. I miss my mother's cooking. I'm trying to keep it alive, but like most Japanese mothers, or most mothers, they didn't work on recipes, right? There was no recipe. Just do it till it looks like this. Make the water cold, but not too cold. Stir it like this, but not too much. Like, okay. That's a long time to figure things out.
And I would love if you told us the story about making food for your boyfriend.
Oh, that was, yeah, a long time ago. We went on an outing, and we're gonna have a picnic. So I made teriyaki chicken for him. And the boyfriend was not Japanese or Asian at all. And the friends were white. I think my boyfriend at that time, he was Latinx. And I made teriyaki chicken for the picnic, and he told the friends that it was cat, that I had made teriyaki cat. And I kept saying, no, it's chicken, it's chicken. See, I'm eating it. See, he's eating it, it's chicken. They would not eat it. They would not eat it. Because there was that stereotype that Asians eat cats. That I had caught and killed a cat and used it for teriyaki. I don't know. But that was really upsetting for me. This one, the Zen Buddhism yoga, I'm just gonna, yeah, you have the right to enjoy Panda Express. It's not, yeah. Go ahead and enjoy sushi burrito, but just know you're not eating sushi, right? Zen Buddhism yoga, the one thing that I really have a hard time with is everyone using the word namaste. Someone said, oh, it just means peace be with you. And I said, then say peace be with you. When we talk about language, language is more than just literal translation, just more than literal translation. So I know that in Japan, in the Japanese language, what Americans will do is they'll hear the word "はい" and they'll think it means yes. Well, it can mean yes, but it doesn't always mean yes. It can mean I hear you, I understand you, and let me think about it when they say "hi," because it is a very polite way of saying, yes, I hear you. And it doesn't always mean yes. And so I know that American business people would often say that the Japanese, you couldn't trust them because they would agree and then they would change things, or they would say, no, we're not doing that, because they said, hey, they did not have a cultural understanding of the language. I mean, it's just like English is very complex. Saying any kind of jokes in English to my mother was just useless because of how you would use the language. And Zen Buddhism and yoga in America always focuses on white use of it. It doesn't look at the cultural use, the cultural background, the cultural history of Zen Buddhism. And that's, again, appropriation, where you don't acknowledge, you don't have an understanding of the historical use, and you use it just to recenter your own experience and your own identities. But yeah, I don't like people using the word namaste. I had a person write a letter to the mayor and sent it to a couple of us for a review, and it was a good letter, except she ended it with namaste. And I said, why is she saying namaste? Don't use namaste. She's not Buddhist.
All right, thank you, Irene. We'll move on to Emilio.
Yes, hello, mabuhay again. My name is Emilio, and I'm speaking and sharing this on behalf of my lived experience. And for y'all to take this, I know I'm saying this because I know it's going to be on YouTube, but like making sure that we're understanding that, you know, I'm not necessarily the authority to speak on this, but I am one person from the Filipino community who happens to have grown up in Salt Lake City, Utah, who was born in the Philippines, and making sure that, you know, that we're understanding that experience. I'm speaking from the lens of, you know, having my knowledge gained from community involvement, studying Asian Pacific Islander studies, Filipino American studies, Philippine studies, and history, and being of Tagalog Bicolnon descent. So what you see here is where my roots are at. I am Tagalog and Bicolnon descent, meaning I am coming from the lands of the southwest of the island of Luzon or Luzon and Katagalugan, which is our quote-unquote ancestral homeland, and Bicolnon, ethnically Bicolnon, which is from the southeast of the Luzon island or Luzon island, called Ibalnong or Kabicolan. And what you see in front of you is just pictures of my roots, my Tagalog identity, my Bicolnon identity, and my involvement in different community organizations in the past 11 years. If I could have next slide, please. So I'm primarily involved with the Filipino and Asian Pacific Islander immigration rights, college student organizations, and folk dance preservation in Salt Lake Valley in Utah. And I'm just sharing this information because I believe that context is always important. It's always necessary for y'all to understand where I'm coming from. I did go through public school after migrating to the United States here in Salt Lake Valley, first at the Jordan School District and then at the Granite School District, most of which, right, were predominantly white institutions, and then eventually to the University of Utah. My racial and ethnic identity development really began the end of my high school experience on going into my first year experience at the University of Utah, where again, I joined the Asian American Student Association and the Pacific Islander Student Association and the other racial ethnic identity student groups in the space, which was interesting, right? Because that's where I kind of started hanging out around more Asian Americans, Filipinos, Filipino Americans, because of the locality and the, you know, the option, right, of higher education with the schools. And so that was also kind of where I you know, continued to experience different things, including you know, my experience with Tagalog language and identity, as well as you know, coming to terms with being, right, an English language learner, and then finding non-Filipino, non-Asian Tagalog language speakers who happen to be returned missionaries who served missions, religious missions in the Philippines. And so if I could go to the next slide, please. Instead of tackling one entire racial category, right, I thought it'd be best to focus on who I am perceived to be and perceived to represent, and who I actually represent. And so, you know, in the context of this, right, I identify, right, I say I'm Filipino, and I've put 4 pictures up there because I think this is what most people think of when they hear Filipino, when they're like, when they ask, you know, what Asian ethnicity are you, or like what specific Asian are you, what kind of Asian are you, right? This is what they're looking for, and this is what they're accustomed to. And I think it's curious to think about, right, that these 4 pictures represent that, because it wasn't Filipino itself, right? That's why I put it in quotations up on the slide. Filipino wasn't necessarily used as an ethnic identity. It's relatively new since the 1960s. Since the 1900s, right? Ever since the Philippine-American War and the Spanish-American War, it was more just a marker of national identity, as in a person who is from the islands of the Philippines. It was a marker of citizenship. And for Filipinos in the Philippines before 1900, right? It was more so to be able to let people know, like, oh, Filipino means you're of Spanish descent. You just were born in the islands of the Philippines. It noted higher power, right, in the colonial caste system. Filipinos and Peninsulares were up there, but the Spanish, right, were the highest on the colonial caste system. But this term itself, right? And we're talking about Asian, we're talking about 40 different ethnic groups. We're talking about Filipino as one of those ethnic groups. I wanted to make this like a case study, right, for other ethnic identities under Asian, which may not just be one thing, right, as it is often simplified. And so we're talking about, right, Filipinos in the Philippines versus what are these other ethno-linguistic groups that might exist. And so if you can have next slide, please. We look at this, right? We look at the complexities of Filipino. With the Philippines, Filipino, I have to make note too that 2021 marks 500 years since the beginnings of Spanish colonization and U.S. imperialism. It's been 500 years since the first contact, right? And so there's a lot of different things that have happened, but for the sake of our time, your time, my time together, we're gonna try to simplify, thousands of years of history of culture in that. When we're talking about Filipino and trying to understand the complexities of it in terms of ethnicity and ethno-linguistic groups, essentially Filipino cultures, Philippine ethnicities, it's not just ethnic cultures. Different ethnic groups are marked that they have different cultures, they have different languages, right? And so I speak Tagalog, and I'm ancestrally through my dad's side Bicolnon, a completely different language, completely different homeland, completely different culture. Unfortunately, it wasn't passed down to him nor me, but that's kind of what is considered Filipino. We come from the lowlands in the Philippines, meaning we're closer to the rivers, to the valleys, to the beaches, and we're more so on the coastline of the north and the northern island and the central island chains. And that's what you'll see in the middle, right? Under the quote unquote Filipino. When we say Filipino, this is usually who we're talking about, right? That kind of dress called the balintawak, the evolved form of the Maria Clara, or sometimes called the Filipiniana, the national dress that you'll see Miss Universe Philippines representing on the world stage. Or whenever you see Filipino gatherings or events, they will stick to this kind of thing. And you'll see how it's kind of, so there's 5 different racial ethnic categories, right, that are kind of lumped here. The first row will be how the dress is, the cultural costumes and cultural attire. The middle is the food that is associated with it. And then the last is the music that is associated with it. We're looking at the middle, and I place it strategically because when we're talking about Filipino, the middle is what we tend to notice and what we refer to, right? We see the food in the middle, roast pig, we see grilled seafood and grilled meats and plenty of vegetables. And then we see, right, the rondalia or the banduria as an evolved form of our music for the lowland Filipinos. As a result of Spanish colonization. And that's what we will hear, right? Or that's what we will see when we refer to Filipino. But I'm here to tell you there's 4 other ethno-linguistic groups that are part of this. So we'll go first on the very left, the Ita, the Aita, the Agta. They are what are known as the some of the original people, or the the indigenous people of the Philippines, of the highlands and the lowlands, and they are phenotypically Black looking. They are phenotypically they are cast as are African Filipinos, but really they've been there the longest, right? That's how they're referred to. And you'll see the food is very different from the center, and they're different instrument and different kinds of dress. And so they're more so ostracized, right, from the Filipino, in the Philippines. They're more so ostracized and are treated as second-class citizens in that sense. Then we have the quote-unquote Igorot. Igorot is actually used to be a pejorative term, local Filipino term to call the people of the mountains. So we have the lowlands, right, the Filipinos. We have the mountain people or the highland people. These are the Igorot. And Igorot is kind of a loose term to describe all of the ethnic and the tribal groups of the mountains. And you'll see, there's this more, it's colder up in the north. They have traditional weaving systems. They have traditional dresses. They have other dances that are not necessarily represented by that middle. And the examples I found are from the Ifugao ethno-linguistic group and the Kalinga ethno-linguistic group. Then to the right of Filipino, we see Moro. Moro is a Spanish term for Muslim, right? These are the Muslim people of the southern Philippines that were there longer than before when the Christians arrived, when the Catholics arrived. But we really see this kind of combination of like pre-colonial, pre-Muslim traditions combined with Muslim traditions. Again, different style of dress, different style of different foods, different music that are associated with that. Then we have the lumad, right? This is one of the Filipino terms for the indigenous, non-Muslim people of the south and of the central region. Again, all these 5 groups, very, very different. Within each group, there are distinct languages, ethnic groups that even identify them from each other. And why I'm saying this to you is usually, right, for dance, I'm part of a Filipino cultural ensemble in Utah. My youth group only sticks to the middle because we know that that's where our ancestries lie. That's who we can trace our ancestries through, and that's who we are descended from. Although there are other people, right, in the dance group that will dance Igorot dances or Moro dances or Muslim dances or Lumad dances because they think that Filipino does encompass all 5 of these. When actually it does not. So we're here to kind of complicate it, right? I know oftentimes when we talk about cultural appropriation, usually it's like, oh, what have white folks or what has the general mass appropriated from Asians or specifically from Filipinos? But here to complicate that conversation a little more, what do we as Filipinos who live in America, as Asians who live in America, appropriate from perhaps non-dominant groups from within our own races, from within our own ethnic groups, our own subcultures? And acknowledging, right, like that these different places are these different ethnic groups are coming from different times, and we're a product and a result of colonization. And so for the Ita, right, they remain to be not necessarily accepted as a whole by the Philippine society, although they are recognized as part of it, they are still kind of treated as outside of it. For Igorot, same thing. There's not too many political representation for them in the Philippine government, but there are people in the diaspora here who are quote unquote Igorot that live in the United States, but came here not as immigrants as many other Filipinos have, but some as refugees after the explosion of Mount Pinatubo in the northern Philippines. And so we have that kind of distinction for that, and making sure that we're understanding that these are, that the differences in these in the times that it's taken have been legacies, right, of colonization and imperialism. And so with that, making sure that we also understand I think Irene was sharing earlier about food. And so I'll share a little snippet of my experience growing up in a high school where I was, my mom, thank you for her, because she was packing me lunch with rice and spam and egg, or rice and Vienna sausage and egg, because I didn't want sandwiches. And she was kind enough to make us that for lunch, but people calling that Filipino food and dog food all in the same breath. When really, right, like, okay, well, this is what is available to us now. Spam itself, right, like, okay, sure, like I'll eat it, and I can see how it has been associated with Philippines, with Filipino American culture. But again, as a product of US imperialism, spam and Vienna sausage really blew up because of World War II, and the Philippines, before being used as a naval base, right, for US military and for the US Navy in order to do whatever they need to do in the Asia Pacific region, right? The Philippines was used as a base, especially in the 50 years that it was a US colony, or a US Commonwealth, sorry. And making sure, that we're understanding that different parts of our culture and how it's presented and packaged is actually, continue to be a result of this, part of this 500 years history, ever since the Spanish first came in contact. So why all of this, right? All context. This is all context for cultural appropriation and what we need to know. So if I could have the next slide, please. This brings into discussion the complexities, right, of what we mean when we're saying cultural appropriation within the Filipino context, because there's so many things happening, right? When we're talking about appropriation earlier, when we gave the definition, we're talking about like dominant groups appropriating from non-dominant groups, right? This is really how we're talking about power, right? Like who has the power? What are the histories that lie in there? Because oftentimes, right, I'll get asked like, oh my gosh, did you see the Filipina aunties that were partying the other day? And they were, wearing, they were doing a hula or luau theme, and they were wearing Hawaiian skirts and having a tiki bar, etc. Is that considered a cultural appropriation? Versus another time, we're like, oh, all these Filipina aunties were having a party, and how come they were wearing chipao or like Chinese ethnic dresses? And really, right, like to answer those two, right, and like what the conversation is happening within it is that with the case of the Hawaiian luau, right, of the Hawaiian theme, right, for any parties, for me, if you were to ask me as a friend, I would say, yeah, maybe just don't do it. Maybe that's not your thing, and if you're having to ask me, maybe that's a sign to back up a little bit. But because we live in the context of Utah, because we live in a context that many Filipinos, there are many Filipinos in our community that came through the LDS Church into Salt Lake, that went to BYU Hawaii. There is that kind of cultural Austronesian language tie between Filipinos and Pacific Islanders and Hawaii. And because of the historical relationship, right, between the Hawaii and the Philippines, both as neo, quote unquote, right, like whatever it is, the relationship, historic relationship with the US, with the Queen Liliuokalani having to sign the bayonet with the bayonet constitution and everything, having to be forcibly giving up the rights and monarchy of Hawaii to the US illegally. And so that happening in 1893, and then in 1898, the Spanish somehow giving the Philippines to the US, even though it wasn't their country in the first place to give, right? All of these happening at the same time, and seeing why is there that relationship, and instead of giving them an answer, I'm telling them, well, what do you think is the history between Hawaii, the Philippines, the US, and all three relationships, and doing that? Because I'm not the authority figure on yes and no on cultural appropriation, but really trying to educate people to educate themselves on why those histories. Similarly, right, with the Filipina aunties wearing the Chinese groups, many Filipinos will say, well, I'm Filipino, I'm actually just mixed Filipino, Chinese, Spanish. Oftentimes not the case, but that's how our history has been reduced to. And so, for many Filipinos, sometimes they might be called Chinoy, right? Filipino Chinese, who wear that. But because of also the thousands of years of history of mercantile trade between the two folks, I honestly don't know who has Chinese ancestry and who doesn't. So I tell them, I'm not the go-to authority here, but ask yourself if you have, if they have may or may not have Chinese ancestry, or they themselves might be Chinese that have been in the Philippines for 10 generations. We don't know. I don't know. You don't know. So I tend to not leave it alone, but kind of help them understand that there are more complexities to that. Then we also talk about, erasure, right? Filipino erasure. And I have these 4 pictures up on the slide. I know, I'll get to it, I promise. But Filipino erasure and invisibility, oftentimes we talk about like, oh, when we talk about Asian, Filipinos are invisible. But I'm like, invisible to whom? I know the Filipinos I know, and I know our Filipino community knows we're up and alive and up very well, and are very active. But that's why I try to shift the focus onto erasure, because it's the mainstream narrative that erases our experiences, our narratives, right? And this particular case, right, on the bottom left of your screen, there was a barkada, right? Barkada means like a group of friends in the Philippines, or in the mainland, and it was a white-owned bar that was trying to come up in DC. But Filipino American organizations nationwide were like, nope, not happening. Cultural appropriation over there. And so the bar did end up closing because they were questioning the owners, like, hey, what's your relationship to Filipino Americans? How are you going to support the Filipino community? Had no answers, shut down, case closed, or so we thought, because then this brought this case over to the Philippines, actually, and Filipinos, right, especially government figures, were like, why are y'all shutting them down? Filipino representation is good. Let the white people have this Barkada name. We're proud that Filipinos are getting noticed and are not invisible in the US. Now this was turning into kind of like motherland versus diaspora, specifically Filipino American politics, right? And fighting on who actually has the say in what, and trying to see who has accountability for this. But you know, this is all being related, right, to the history of colonization and imperialism, and the need to be seen, but also the constant erasure that is happening to Filipinos who live in the U.S. And you know, there's different incidents of hate. One happened right in Layton, Utah. The Filipino-owned food truck called world famous Yum Yum food truck had very anti-Asian slurs written on it. It had "Go Back Home" written on it. All of these things, right, from people that don't do it. And as I wrap up here, one of the things that I just wanted to point that out, because you know, I think we focus on cultural appropriation or these incidents as individual acts, but we have to remember that it is actually related to the ongoing and the legacy of colonization and imperialism that continues that the Filipino communities continue to face here. And I'm showing right on the bottom right again a figure of perhaps a non-Igorot Filipino Canadian actually wearing indigenous woven fabrics in the style that is not indigenous, but we don't know if it was designed or not by actual indigenous people, because this isn't the traditional style. And there's that. And I'm gonna throw in two like last things as I hand it over to the next speaker, but talking about, you know, Pusong Pinoy, especially like the Filipino at heart, especially that we live in Utah. A lot of people feel like they're Filipino, but are not part of the community. And this other conversation of Filipino as Asian or Pacific Islander, that's a whole nother topic, right? But I wanted to do this because, you know, this all relates to cultural appropriation. And when we talk about cultural appropriation and Asians, Filipino isn't necessarily one that is seen as part of that conversation because it's not as marketed, right, or commercialized, perhaps as Irene saying, as the Japanese you know, experience in terms of kimono, right, that is easily packaged and visible and seen. Then we see this other part of erasure within other Asian ethnic groups. So thank you, and I apologize, I went a little over time, but next speaker. Oh yeah, and that's the org, but yeah, thanks, Diana.
Okay, thank you, Emilio. That was an awesome presentation. I'll be speaking on my Korean Iranian American heritage and the microaggressions I experienced growing up, and pretty much the disparity between the two, because I've had a really interesting experience where there are microaggressions as I was growing up, like I said, but it's very different, and I guess that's what you'll see throughout my presentation. So starting on my Korean side, a lot of my frustration has really developed over the past few years. Oh, and I wanted to clarify, if anybody has any questions during my presentation, please just throw it in the chat and I'll do my best to respond to that. I want this to be a conversation. Anyway, so I've had a lot of frustration with K-pop just in the most recent, or I should say Korean media in the recent years, because I feel like in the globalization that K-pop has experienced recently, where I listened to K-pop growing up, you know, as a Korean American, and that was in my junior high and high school years, and I noticed that you know, there was a lot of authenticity in a lot of its messaging. It was a lot of like, be yourself, love yourself, especially BTS was one of my favorite groups growing up. And they really championed like this idea of like mental health. And that was something that was core to like almost counterculture to the Korean, like keep your head down, just do the work, like don't create a scene. But BTS was like championing the create a scene, you know, do your thing. But now that they're globalized and they're internationally famous, they're making ballads with Halsey. So like you can kind of see the transition there, where like yes, they are still, you know, putting out a message, and yes, they are still doing what they can, and obviously they shouldn't bear the brunt of the weight and they shouldn't bear the brunt of expectations. But really, it's been disappointing to see that a lot of Korean media, or at least the entertainment industry, could really go so far as to display, like put on a blatant display of the history and struggle that Korea has had to become the powerhouse it is today. And it's not just an ignorance of that, it's almost an erasure. And that is because there's a capitalistic push to continue to globalize. So what I mean by this is, think of the consumers today of Korean media and like K-pop or Korean dramas, right? A lot of that is young, white American females. And so because Korean media really, you know, they understand this, and a lot of the entertainment industry really wants to push for further globalization, they create this area of conformity where it's very easy to conform to the viewer's expectations. Therefore, it doesn't tell one true, like, this is Korea, this is our story. It's, hey, make Korea be whatever you want it to be. And that allows a lot of these viewers to create their own assumptions behind Korean media of what Korea is. And I know this because I didn't live in Korea growing up. I lived in Boise, Idaho. And so from my Western lens, I will admit, like, I came in with the idea of what Korea was. And then 3 years ago, I moved to Korea for about 6 months. I studied there, I lived there, I experienced daily life there. And I can say it is completely different. It is not at all what I expected. And so because of that Western lens, it's so easy to romanticize or idealize or fetishize Korean men or Korean culture or Korean lifestyle. And again, like I'm saying, this is really, really easy with how quickly Korean media is so willing to conform to the Western ideal. And so on the next slide, we will see the phenomenon of what is known as a Korea-boo. And this is something that is actually terrifying to me to see as a Korean woman, that a lot of people will, as I said, like from a Western lens. So this person is Oli London. They are a non-binary individual who is a self-proclaimed Korean, but they're British. And so they essentially are an extreme version of a Korea-boo. And what a Korea-boo is, if none of you are familiar with that, is essentially they are such a fan, or a fan, I use that term very lightly, but essentially they have become obsessed with the idea of Korean culture. And this is not just cultural appropriation, this is cultural exploitation. This is taking an idea of what culture is and co-opting it to say, oh, because I saw this K-pop video, or oh, because I follow this group, or, you know, I saw this movie, I now know what it is. I now know everything about Korea, and I'm gonna make it my own. And so that is what I mean by cultural exploitation, to where, I mean, Oli London, this person, like, they got surgery to look like a Korean K-pop star. And so that is essentially a really big issue with Korean media, is that they don't really try to tackle Korea-boos at all. Like, that's not something that they come to terms with. That's not something that they call out and say, hey, what you're doing is unacceptable. That's cultural appropriation. They feed off it, and they really allow for that conformity to push and push and push the idea of idealizing or romanticizing Korea. And I'm reading Dio's question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Oli London explained themselves as transracial, where they claim to have transitioned into a Korean identifying person. You're absolutely right, Dio. Thank you for that. Yeah, if you can see, like, with their tweet on the right-hand side of the screen, the last sentence is, thank you for the overwhelming support. It was so hard for me to come out as them, they, core/Ian, which I don't even know what core/Ian is. Like, I don't know what that is, but someone said EO. Oh, okay, that was, thank you for correcting me on the pronunciation, EO. But yeah, so essentially, back to the point though, this Oli London basically just came out as transracial. And actually, if you remember Rachel Dolezal, who came out as transracial towards being Black or like identifying as African, was super problematic, but Rachel Dolezal actually stepped out in defense of Oli London, saying that Oli basically had every right to do this, and that the negativity that Oli experienced was essentially social media negativity, which is problematic in and of itself, but yes. I just wanted to put, before we move on, I just wanted to make one statement that I did speak to a few Koreans and like Koreans within the community. And while a lot of them are very, you know, they're obviously, they find this ridiculous, they find this pathetic, they find this offensive. A lot of them sadly do actually appreciate that. And that's something that is reflected in like Korean media, where they will again like kind of coddle the Koreaboo, and that's almost really sad, because if you see like a lot of Koreans expecting their culture to be immediately dismissed, when it's on the flip side, when people start romanticizing and fetishizing their culture and they start to appreciate that, that's actually really sad to just be like, wow, someone doesn't hate our culture, we're actually appreciated. But like, it's not appreciated, it's fetishized, it's romanticized, it's creepy, it's stalkerish, you know what I mean? So yeah, it's definitely an idea more of the culture, right? Thank you so much. Yeah, so we can move on to the next slide. So this covers more of my Iranian side, but I wanted to highlight, especially because Halloween is sort of coming up, or at least the shopping for the costumes. I feel like everyone from an Asian culture can attest to the fact that there has been some form of appropriation of their culture at Halloween time. And so this is very problematic in the Iranian, like towards the Iranian community as well. I wanted to mention too, a lot of Iran or just the Middle East in general is grouped. And I think a lot of our past speakers have touched on this as well. But there's the idea that there's just one Middle Eastern appearance. And so you'll see this with Halloween costumes. And then again, like Irene was saying, with the kimono, there's a hypersexualization of women. We see the same thing with the hijab, the burqa, the chador. There's a hypersexualization at Halloween time where they will intentionally take something that is supposedly a token of respect in a culture or a religion, and they will hypersexualize it. And then on the flip side, they will then claim that the men in that culture are oppressive or they're misogynistic, and the women are submissive and docile and are sexualized by the men. But guess who's sexualizing in this case? It's Western industry, it's Western culture, and it's the Western male gaze. And so it's actually very hypocritical, and it's incredibly, incredibly offensive to see. And this is something that I always grew up with, you know, at whatever Halloween party, it would always be some idiotic frat boy dressed like the picture on the left. And so it's quite disappointing to see a lot of times. And I wanted to highlight this. I pulled statements from different articles and things, and I linked it in the speaker notes. So if you'd like, I can definitely drop that in the chat as well, if you'd like to read up more on it. But elements of our culture are used really to isolate and dehumanize the culture or people of the culture. And one of the videos made a really good point that the culture is all about its people. So when you're dehumanizing the people, you're entirely eradicating a culture. And that's the idea of cultural exploitation or cultural co-opt, is to eradicate a culture and restructure it as one's own. And that's a lot of times what Western people or Western media is doing to a lot of Asian culture or ethnic groups around the world. Also, if you see, like, a lot of times you'll go to a party or something like that. I can attest to a personal experience where, again, as I said, I attended Westminster. I was part of this program, and the program put on I think it was like titled Middle Eastern Nights or something like that. And just reading the title, I was like, God, I know this is going to be like problematic. But I went to the party, and there were aspects of cultural appropriation there. I don't mean to use this to bash Westminster. Westminster is a great institution and really is pretty progressive and does a great job teaching to avoid this type of issue. But unfortunately, I think the person putting it on just simply really, they were just not thinking. And actually the author of this article says that it is possible for a person from like a white culture, or excuse me, a white ethnic group to put on a party and still have it be like respectful and be cultural appreciation rather than cultural appropriation. I personally disagree with that. I think, as Emilio said, like maybe just don't do that. Like if you're not from the culture, maybe just don't use the culture as a freaking prop, because like we're not your prop. Like we are not your, like I think Jeremy wrote a viral tweet that he'll also talk about, but like we are not your costume, okay? We are not your prop. We are not, like, our culture and our people do not exist for you to be like, oh, look at that, looks fun, like let's do that. No, like that's not fun. A lot of that comes from struggle, a lot of that comes from turmoil, and a lot of that comes from deep history that is oftentimes just completely ignored. So it's absolutely unacceptable to use it and be like, no, we're appreciating. No, you're not appreciating. You're appropriating, you're exploiting. It's not cool. Anyway, so a lot of times people will, wear turbans to a party as part of their costume. But the reason why this is such a problematic issue is that, the same people who wear this to a party, for example, they'll wear it to the party and they can wear them, like this author said, without context or excuse me, without consequence or worry. But at the same time, a lot of like Sikhs or Muslims in public, like their turbans are used as a mockery to them. And they're used to essentially, again, dehumanize or isolate them. And that's something that shows the disparity between privileged world or privileged America and the less so privileged. I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I really wanted to point out, I don't think a lot of people know what Iran looked like pre-Islamic Revolution. So this was 1970s Iran. A lot of times people think like Iran, the key word or the the immediate idea is a chador or a hijab, or which hijab, by the way, is an Arabic word. It's chador, that's a Persian word. And I think a lot of Persian words have kind of been like swiped up in like this Arabic context, or like Arabic has kind of taken over. And so we really want to try to maintain the traditional like Persian words. So that's chador. And so that's the full headdress that you'll see a lot of people wear in Iran. But this was the pre-Islamic Revolution. You'll see that this even looks like a Western landscape. This looks like something that comes out of like an American magazine. So actually Iran had a lot of Western influence back before the pre-Islamic Revolution. So that's just something I wanted to point out as well, because I don't think a lot of people know that. Awesome. Okay, so thank you for the time reminder. So here is, I'm going to talk about the Asian representation in media. They have essentially, with a lot of Middle Eastern representation, it's on the clear opposite side of what like Far Eastern representation would be, that I'll touch on in a little bit. But essentially, Middle Eastern representation in media is oftentimes the terrorist or the bad guy, or the innocent bystander that the heroic American soldier will then save. So really, it's always like, again, a dehumanization, a mockery of what the Middle Easterner typically is. And so there's actually a charity in the UK that aims to champion authentic representation and remove Islamophobia from the big screens. And so there's something called the Riz test, which is named after the British actor Riz Ahmed, which asks those 5 questions at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And essentially, they'll compare that to any type of film or media presentation. And if there's a yes, if any of those questions you can answer yes to the character's portrayal in that film or in that media piece, it is then considered Islamophobic representation. And so that really helps to be like, okay, let's make sure we go through and make sure that this character does not identify or does not really represent any of these like misinformed ideals. And that way we can avoid Islamophobia in media. And then on the flip side of things, on the next slide, we will see essentially Far East Asian representation in media, and that has its own issues, and something that I think a lot of Asians in general are really excited about, but like almost sadly is that we'll kind of breadcrumb ourselves to where like if there's even a hint of representation in media, we're like, yay, representation, but it's like completely misinformed. You'll see the idea of the model minority in Crazy Rich Asians, where Asians are supposed to be successful, they're wealthy, they're rich. Again, the model minority. Not every Asian is like that, obviously, but that's really something that Crazy Rich Asians really painted. And then on the flip side of things, you'll see To All the Boys I've Loved Before in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, which essentially, I think she was supposed to be in this show, she was like half Korean and half white. And then I think as the show progresses, spoiler alert, she does like end up with the popular hot white guy. And so the issue with this representation was that it's again the pairing of a white man and an Asian woman, and that's something that I know a lot of people in the Asian community, or specifically the Korean community, felt a little disappointed with, just because throughout the show's development, she had the opportunity to go with like a Black man, she had the opportunity to go with like I think there was like a Latinx guy in there too. But she didn't. She ultimately ended up with a white man, which again was like kind of again focusing the lens back on the Western white ideal and like idealizing that. And so that was something that a lot of people were really disappointed with. So then, and that's just the surface level, we can go through that, but I don't have enough time. So then we have Never Have I Ever, which was highly anticipated because, as you can see from those last two media examples, we only had like Far Eastern representation, but we had like finally we had like Southeastern representation. And so Southeastern Asians, or a lot of those that I know, were very excited about this, but unfortunately this movie had its own examples of Islamophobia. It had its own the show had its own examples of ableism and casteism as well, because she's supposed to be Indian, I believe was her background. But yeah, so it had its own issues, and I linked an article as well. If you'd like me to drop it in the chat, I can. All right. So I quickly wanted to touch on the model minority myth. That is the difference between my two sides. So beginning with my Korean side, I noticed, and I actually did an experiment on this, kind of a social experiment. I would go out into public and I would only present myself as Korean. And then a different day, I would go out into public and I'd only present myself as Iranian. And of course, this is when people ask, like, what's your ethnicity, right? But I would try to, in those cases where people would ask, the difference with how it was received when I said, oh, I'm Korean, immediately there was the idea that like, oh, you're a successful like student, you're here, you're there, you're doing these different things, you're active. When I said I was Iranian, there was kind of a hesitation, because especially after 9/11 and all of that, I did receive, like in junior high, I received a lot of 9/11 like jokes, which was super, just completely offensive and wrong. And that was just something, and to be honest, I've received a lot of like, kind of to Irene's story of the cat, like I did receive a lot of like dog eating comments as well to relate to my Korean side, but it was dog eating and terrorism. That was like all I heard to talk to kind of discuss my history growing up as Korean Iranian American. But essentially it was that, like when I presented my Iranian side, it was a lot of hesitation, a lot of like almost uncomfortability with how to go about like moving forward with that topic, you know, just because it was almost seemed as like controversial to be Iranian, which like there's not. Like I'm very sad to say this, but I had a very difficult time appreciating my Iranian side until very recently. And that was just because I felt like when I presented myself as Iranian, I instantly felt the uncomfortability behind that. And therefore I became uncomfortable with my own heritage. And that's something that was really sad. And that was something that I really had to confront. So actually with being Iranian, I did not experience the model minority. I experienced the opposite. A lot of times people would expect that I was, you know, like what was shown in the media, which is essentially like this scary, like unknown thing that is meant to be feared. And that was something that I did not experience when I presented myself as Korean. So that was an interesting disparity there. I think that's my last slide. Pretty sure that is, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Diana. You did such an amazing job. We're gonna pass it off to you. I'm so excited. This is so great. I'm learning so much, and thank you guys so far through the speakers for sharing about your trauma. This stuff is not easy. It's exhausting and tiring.
I also want to just say thanks, like especially with Diana and everyone who went before. Like it was just really wonderful and an honor and a privilege to hear everything you guys wanted to, or everyone had to say. So I really appreciate everyone opening up with what they were willing to share, and it was really informative and educational. But with going into my slides and my section, I want to first jump into for cultural appropriation. I wanted to talk about fashion, as fashion and cultural garments are probably the most talked about and most highlighted topic when it comes to like discourse with appropriation. So again, just to clarify the difference between appropriation and appreciation. Appropriation is when a privileged group, usually a group of the majority or a group that holds power, and in America, that's the white community. It's when a group that holds power and privilege adopts and exploits a part of a culture and uses it for personal benefit against a marginalized group. So that personal benefit can be for profit, exploitation, pure aesthetics, or for like comedic purposes. People do like SNL skits or like movies, anything like that. So in general, it's anything that doesn't pay tribute, respect, or give credit to the culture, history, or the origins of a cultural piece or whatever idea or practice someone is taking or borrowing. Whereas appreciation is when someone pays tribute and respect to the culture, origins, and history of a cultural piece. So an example of this would be a cultural wedding. So if I was to have a wedding where I wanted to include my culture and my tradition, I would have my wedding guests wear traditional clothing. So for me, that'd be aoyais. And this would be a time where it would be appreciation because my wedding guests would be partaking in my culture with respect, wearing a garment to celebrate tradition at my ceremony, right? So they'd be paying tribute to me with my permission to my culture. Jumping in just into sexualizing stereotyping, one of the ways fashion and cultural garments can be disrespected, oftentimes is by sporting it in a sexualizing manner when the garment is not supposed to be worn in a sexualized way at all. So oftentimes people wear and take cultural garments and wear it in an incorrect way without doing research or spending time to respect the garment, many times to present a sexual image the person wants to create. And I will preface this by saying, if you are creating content, art, taking pictures, anything like that, there's nothing wrong with that. But when you inaccurately disrespect or manipulate aspects of a culture and sexualize it, that's where it becomes very harmful because you're then portraying a false image and objectify people who do belong to that culture. So for example, here in this, on my slide, you see Casey Musgrave. She wears an aoyai. It's a very traditional Vietnamese garment, and you're supposed to wear pants with it, as clearly she's not. You wear it for cultural, traditional, and celebratory events, and she wore it for a concert. She didn't wear it correctly, and not only that, she also included, if you look closely on her head as a hair and head accessory, she includes an Indian headpiece. It's called a tikka. And you don't just go around mixing various cultures for your aesthetic purposes. That's just disrespectful to both cultural parties here. You disregard the cultural significance to both of those pieces. So if you are going to wear a cultural garment, you need to wear it correctly in the way it's supposed to be worn. So you have to be mindful and respectful of other cultures. And my rule of thumb is if you have to think twice about it, if what you're doing is respectful or not, you just shouldn't do it at all. And even if you are going to do something and you're pretty sure it's gonna be okay, but still the slight hesitant, you should ask someone from that culture or do research on it, because otherwise it's just gonna be messy, and we don't want to do that. But also I've noticed with lately with Asian makeup has been very trendy and in the spotlight lately. And as someone who wears makeup regularly, I also think it's great to learn new makeup techniques and hear about new products I could be interested in using. There's never anything wrong with that. But some people, however, are crossing the line and using makeup techniques that are made and used specifically on Asian facial features. And I think that's inappropriate because these are techniques that will purposely make someone who is not Asian, make them attempt to look Asian. So what I'm referring to now is when people will exaggerate their eyeliner and manipulate their eye shape to be smaller or squintier, or even when they had that trend with the fox eye trend where people would pose pulling their eyes back. It's just disrespectful because throughout history, Asian eyes have always been frowned upon. They've always been unlovable. They haven't, it's not something that was something people were drawn to. So to have people who are always making fun of it and having those exact same people now wanting to look like me is just a slap in the face. It's just because it's trendy to them. And like again, like as Jeremy said, we'll talk about this later, but like my culture is not your costume. It's not your trend. It's not just some like makeup aesthetic. That's not what it is. It's just offensive, and it's not something you should do if you're not Asian, because it's simply just racist. Now, also when people dress or portray Asians for Halloween or SNL skits or in movies, people will also exaggerate their Asian costume or character. So they'll do this by, squinting their eyes or doing makeup. I think I do have a next slide that shows some pictures on this. Let's see. But, they'll squint their eyes and do like makeup to express Asian facial features, or they'll even speak in an Asian accent with broken English. This is yellow face. So if you're going to have an Asian character in a skit or in a movie, you should just hire an Asian person. Like Asian people are just as capable as doing anything a white person can do. Like we exist and we can be hired for those roles. So like if those roles are to be created, then it must be reserved for an Asian purpose. Again, otherwise you are participating in yellow face. So even if someone wants to dress as an Asian character for Halloween cosplay, that's completely fine. You don't have to manipulate your facial features to be Asian. You can just wear the costume. Say Suki from Fast and Furious, you can just wear, her pink pants and a purple tank top, and we'll automatically pretty much know you're being Suki from Fast and Furious, and that's no problem at all. But I also want to note, you should never dress as like an actual Asian person or someone from another race. Just like, say if someone would be, just wanted to be a Vietnamese person, they would just wear an ao dai. That's not how, you just shouldn't do that. But there's nothing wrong with, say, dressing as Bruce Lee, wearing like his yellow tracksuit, or, Alex from Charlie's Angels, played by Lucy Liu. But again, there are limits to that on how you should dress, as I stated before. And again, you should just follow rule of thumb. And if you were wanting to participate or were interested in wearing cultural garments. I also do want to include as well with cross-cultural appropriation that even just because you are a minority, that doesn't mean you can't be racist either. Being a minority doesn't give you immunity to behave in a racist way. So with cross-cultural appropriation is when someone from another minority group exploits, adopts, or profits off of another minority group's culture. So an example of this would be an Asian pop and rap. Here on the slide on the bottom right-hand side, there's that GIF. That's a Vietnamese rapper. I believe her name is Kimmy's. And she's wearing like, she's wearing braids in her hair, and that's not something she should be sporting. That's not part of her culture, right? So she's wearing these protective hairstyles are reserved only for Black, African, and African American communities. That's disrespectful because these Asian rappers they're only wearing them for aesthetic purposes, and they don't understand what those hairstyles are or the historical and cultural significance of them. So this instance would be a time of cross-cultural appropriation. And cross-cultural appropriation does happen, and it's something it's not a lot, but it's something that BIPOC people need to be aware of, as we have to be respectful to neighboring cultures and being respectful to others. But moving on from like fashion and like visual aesthetics, I also wanted to talk about cuisine and food. And oftentimes food is not a field where people will realize it can be cultural appropriated. So it's almost as if it's a new discussion within this topic. So in this particular case, I wanted to talk about something that just went viral recently. It's from a white woman. Her name is Karen Taylor. Her name's actually Karen. She claims to have improved congee, which is a dish that's been invented roughly in 1000 BC. It's a dish that several Asian cultures have a version of. So in my Vietnamese culture, it's called jiao. And it's a dish that's a comfort food for so many people. It's a dish that's nostalgic. It's a dish that every generation has eaten and cooked. And it's a dish that many people had to survive off because it only requires two main ingredients, rice and water. It's affordable. It's something that can fill a family and make sure everyone in the family has food in their belly. After this case went viral, Karen stated, she issued an apology statement, and she said she was sorry and that she fell short of honoring the Asian community for congee. And she also says that she would donate 15% of sales to the Asian Mental Health Collective and continue to donate 1% of sales or 10% of profit, whichever is larger, to nonprofit and activist organizations like Asian Americans Advancing Justice. So her whole operation is an act of white supremacy because Karen she says she improved congee and creates a business where she takes congee, manipulates it for the consumption of the white community. In addition, she profits off of that. And then she takes credit for something that is not hers. And I will quote from a statement from Asian Americans Advancing Justice. They responded to her apology statement, which was one of the organizations she attempted to donate money to after this incident. They stated, "We reject white supremacy practices that claim different or that claim entitlement to our community's culture and change them for white audiences to make a profit." So for the company as an apology, they just wanted to donate their small sum of 1% of sales, just 1%. That's not a lot. And then after that, they will still continue to choose their product. So they're just looking for a way to enable and continue their appropriation. So they think that donating that 1% in sales is going to brush everything over. This will also serve an example for other businesses that may also be appropriating off of an item and profiting off of something, right? So that they think that if you just apologize with money, that everything will be okay, but it's much deeper than that. They don't take into account that if you're working in a business that profits off of appropriating something, that you're also contributing to the act of erasing and speaking over culture, like that, the erasure of culture in America is never ending and it's continuous. It's dangerous for cultural communities where white communities invite themselves in without understanding our culture and exploit things. It's like they're breaking and entering into our culture, trespassing, and then they're stealing my things. So it's very frustrating to know that your culture is just, played around and nitpicked. But just gonna pause there. Does anyone have any questions so far or anything to say before I move on? Okay. I also wanted to talk about how the view on cultural foods have changed in the past versus now in the present. So if you were wanting, or actually, I'm sorry, that was my after point. Going into appreciation. So if you wanted to appreciate and learn about a different food or cuisine from a culture that's not yours, you can do that no problem. Like you can do that while being respectful. And the correct way to do that is to visit a local business and restaurant in your area that are owned and operated by someone from that culture. And you would support that local business and enjoy the culture with respect. Or if you want to say cook a dish from that culture that's not yours, you would find a recipe that's created and taught by someone from that culture. I don't know, but I would never let Bobby Flay or Gordon Ramsay teach me how to make pho. That makes me so uncomfortable. And like, they may be famous chefs, but that's not their culture to teach, as they don't have a right to. Like, they don't have the right to teach cuisines that are not theirs because they don't have a cultural tie to Vietnamese cuisine. Because if they taught it with their widely known presence in the cooking community, they would be taking up space from other Vietnamese chefs that they shouldn't be taking up. It wouldn't be respectful or allow or enable, and it would enable the erasure of the Vietnamese cooking culture. Let's see, Janessa said, are people participating in cultural appropriation of the and yes, absolutely. Like I see a lot of people, like a lot of white people will create pho restaurants and they'll make vegan pho. Pho is not vegan. It never has been. We don't eat it with mushrooms or tofu. We have those ingredients in other dishes, but that's not in pho. That's just not pho. It's something completely different. So yeah, going to a restaurant that's owned by a white person who like has no like instruction, no cultural ties, nothing like that. It's just so uncomfortable and just incorrect. But talking about, I also wanted to bring up how in the past, say like 15 years ago, a lot of Asian food wasn't really popular. And if it was very Americanized. And now it's something that's seen as very new and hip or exotic. So lots of Vietnamese food is popular now, like pho and banh mi sandwiches. And I'm just wondering now, does anyone actually know any other traditional Vietnamese dishes besides pho and banh mi or sandwiches? Like if you do, type them in the chat box because I would like to know. But I feel like, to me, those are the only like 3 dishes people know when it comes to Vietnamese cuisine. Yes, Van That's very good. Yes. Emilio knows what we have, and I appreciate that. And we have so many other dishes that people don't know, but I feel I know other people would, really appreciate, and they would just love it. So my food isn't a trend for it to be in and out of the media or be in a spotlight for only a small amount of time or only known like on the very surface level. So again, I'll reiterate, if you enjoy Vietnamese foods, please take the time to learn about the food for what it is. It's not a trend and it's not an aesthetic. You should learn how to say the dishes correctly, learn what's in the food, learn how to properly eat the dishes and learn what the dish is, and learn that the Vietnamese cuisine is not, again, just the surface level of pho and sandwiches. So we really appreciate for someone to take the time to understand and learn about something new and educate yourself on how to properly respect a culture. And moving on from this slide, I also wanted to bring in medicinal practices. A lot of people now are branching out into ancient and holistic medicinal practices for health. So this is something to also be very mindful of and to pay respects to whichever culture the practice belongs to. Again, learn from Asian practitioners, let Asian practitioners teach their practices. If you need to buy like equipment, I would buy it again from like that particular Asian practice and not speak over these ancient practices. So here you see in the photos, that is what coining is. So there is an ancient folk remedy for healing that Vietnamese people use in times of sickness, and this is called coining. There are also different and similar healing practices in other Asian cultures, such as like gua sha. So coining itself involves applying an oil or balm to the skin on the back, shoulders, or arms. Then you would take a coin and you would rub or scrape out the sickness or the fever from someone's body. It can be known to get rid of heatness or fevers. And as you can see after coining, it leaves really harsh red lines. It does go away after a few days. A lot of times after you're done, you feel very relieved. Your body feels more relaxed. You feel more energetic after you coin out. But because of the harsher lines that the coining leaves behind on the body, a lot of white physicians have also accused parents or people of child abuse or abuse itself. This is another case of ignorance and intrusion of the white privilege and power, where white physicians will not acknowledge cultural methods of healing and only see white health practices as the only acceptable form of health, which is incorrect. It dismisses ancient and cultural healing practices, Asian practitioners, and it also criminalizes Asian and Vietnamese people for this healing practice that's been widely used in our culture throughout history. So in combination with the food, the fashion, and the medicinal practices, I mean, there are others, but that's what I've included in today. These are all things that are being highly appropriated, and I hope this has all kind of shed some light on how to properly respect a culture for deeper understanding. But this is, again, just the surface of it. There's so much more that we could talk about and include in today's discussion. But I also wanted to include rhetoric and intention. The word someone uses when they talk about a culture or an aspect of a culture is very important. You should be respectful and mindful of terms when addressing a culture, and this pertains to all cultures around the world. So I just wanted to ask some people if you've heard or even yourself have said anything, have learned from ways that someone could be talking or addressing a culture disrespectfully. You can type it in the chat box if you would like. I know a lot of times when people talk about clothes, they'll say, oh, that's really weird, or that's ugly and hideous. Like I would never wear that. Like that just looks like not modern, or just anything like that. But that's incredibly disrespectful. And I understand everyone has different tastes, and that's completely fine. But when it pertains to a culture and has cultural and historical significance, that's just, it's important to those cultures because it holds so much cultural value in it. And that's not for you to say, because I'll be honest, we don't care what your opinion is. We're still gonna do it. That's part of our culture and we're gonna keep to it, I don't care. But the way you talk about these things can be very disrespectful, and that's something you need to be very mindful of. But then also for food as well, right? So people will say a lot of things are wild or exotic, which is just, if I'm gonna be honest, if you look at it statistically, Asians make up the majority of the world, and then white people are actually the minority. So if anything, white people are more exotic than I am. But food, when you talk about it, people say, oh, it's really gross, or it's disgusting, or it's super smelly. That's incredibly disrespectful. And again, everyone does have different tastes and smells. Some people are very sensitive. Some people can't smell perfumes a lot. Their scents and their senses are very sensitive, and that's okay. But you don't have to say, you don't have to say these very condescending words to talk about another culture and talk about something else being saying white culture is more superior for being more cleanly or something, because that's just not how it is. but with intention, like even if you don't like something, the intention of politely or kindly saying something is very important. You can always say something with kindness and respect no matter what it is. And I strongly stand by that. Like even if it's something you don't agree with, something you don't particularly like, there's always a polite way to address something. I also wanted to talk about how in America, the majority or the most powerful group is the white community. So cultural communities come to America and they bring their traditions and their culture with them. So here as minorities, as children of immigrants and refugees, we have to keep our own cultures alive in a land that doesn't actively uplift them. We are constantly feeling our own culture's existence here. Otherwise it would, die out. It would be manipulated, disrespected, and be diminished in value. Whereas in other countries, say in Vietnam, Vietnamese culture is alive and well there. They don't have to constantly fight to keep the traditions alive there because that's home to their culture. So when someone who has culturally appropriated something, they will often seek validation from natives from that country. So and there sometimes natives will agree that the perpetrator did nothing wrong and that they're just enjoying the culture, even if that person obviously appropriated something from a culture and disrespected it. And why? It's because the perpetrator is seeking validation from Asian natives. They will bring them this will bring them confirmation and enable the perpetrator to continue doing what they're doing and feel that they did nothing wrong. But they don't understand that in America, the Vietnamese community has to fight for our culture to purely exist, in a respectful way. So to disrespect an aspect of a culture that someone took for the personal benefit, that participates in the erasing of the cultural and historical significance of what was appropriated. That harms these cultural communities in Americas when we are already fighting so hard to keep our traditions and cultures alive. And thank you, Mayela, for the time reminder. And I do want to note that Natives' opinions do matter on this, and it is wonderful to share culture and enjoy it, but it's also important to note the differences of our struggles to having to keep our cultures alive in America versus trying where we don't have to keep our cultures alive in our home country. So I just wanted to talk about that. So there's a respectful way to participate in culture in disrespectful ways, and that's where we have to kind of understand the differences of that. And then also bringing up accountability. So if people do make a mistake, you do, appropriate something, I believe people can always learn from your mistakes. I myself have made mistakes and I have been ignorant before I started educating myself. And I think if you do something wrong, you learn from it, you apologize genuinely if there was a need to apologize, learn, and then you educate yourself. So this means doing research, speaking to people, and disciplining yourself by working on destroying your inner and unconscious racist mentality. But also understand that BIPOC people, it's not our job to constantly educate you. We can create times and environments to educate others, like say in a classroom or being in this workshop. These are spaces for us to share and educate others. But outside of this, that's not why I exist. I'm not an educator. I'm not a professor 24/7. That's not who I am. So you need to know when to ask questions and educate yourself through personal interaction. And also you should know when you should research your education online through factual and legitimate educational resources or through other personal interactions that have those times that line up with their own time that they've set aside to want to educate others. So you also can't just, be respectful of BIPOC people and not just bombard them constantly with, educational questions. And then really quickly, just wanted to quickly touch on before I end on assimilation and white validation. So as an American or as an Asian American living in Utah, I went to a high school that had less than 5 Asian students there that would rotate through grades, including me. And I knew and I was aware from a young age that I was different physically and mentally with who I am. I have Black hair and I have smaller eyes physically, and then at home, we have like family values and family rules that my family operates differently than a typical white family does. And I always felt like the odd person out in my classes. My peers would ask me condescending questions and were always weirded out by me. And I hated the feeling that I was some exotic doll or like the neighborhood kid. And I wanted to fit in like everyone else and not have to, I just didn't want to have to go through and experience these microaggressions And so to do that, I would entertain the kids by going, I wish I had blonde hair like you, you know, like it's so pretty. Or like, you're right, like my eyes are small. Like I would take things as a joke to play things off so I could agree with them. And, you know, I feel like a lot of BIPOC people who come here and they grow up as children experience those things because they just want to fit in. They don't want to be, you know, othered. And so I ended up having to like lose myself, and now I had to let that go, try to find myself again and differentiate. Like, you know, I am who I am, that's my culture, and I just have to, it is what it is. And I love my culture. You have to be, you know, you just have to acknowledge that. So I was able to get out of that mentality, and some people haven't. And some people have to constantly seek that white validation just to try to fit in. I'm just gonna skip over, but going into ESL really quick. I'm not sure if everyone knows what ESL classes are, but it's a lot of classes people take in their primary education years. So it means English as a second language classes. So it's a supplementary classes a lot of us were forced to take, where we'd be pulled out of our classrooms and into separate classrooms filled with other BIPOC students. And then a lot of, even if we spoke English and even if you didn't, you were forced to take those classes. And if you did speak your native native language in a lot of classes, your teachers would, you know, constantly be upset at you. You should speak English. They would, you know, chastise you. And, you know, school in America is not a melting pot, like how America is portrayed. It's simply a white space, and diversity is not normalized. So my home life contradicted my school life. And I will say that ESL classes and the expectation to speak English and being immersed in only a white space erased my language for me. I don't speak fluent Vietnamese anymore. My Vietnamese speaking skills are now very limited, and I wish I did speak it fluently as I did when I was a kid. But the practice of forcing a child to only speak English in a school where English is the force, I'm sorry, I'm skipping over my words. But the practice of forcing a child to only speak English in a school is the first impression that only white and English is acceptable. Otherwise, you know, we got yelled at, we got scolded at for being who we were, or we were made fun of. So this action, you know, participated in the erasure of diverse cultures and BIPOC children and enforced white normality and white standards. So I just wanted to talk about that and end on that note with the education system and how that also erases our culture.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Yo.
Okay.
Jeremy.
Well, hello everybody. I'm Jeremy again. My mother is actually Taiwanese, and my father is a Vietnamese refugee from the Vietnam War. And growing up, so it's funny because me and D.I.V.A, we went to the same high school, so I know exactly what she's talking about. I think a lot of the issue too is that a majority of the Asian people at our high school were exchange students. So they didn't get, they did not know what it was like to grow up being born and raised, I guess, as an Asian American from birth, you know, in our neighborhood, growing up around white children, being surrounded by white children. So there's that. And I had a similar experience to her as well, where I basically lost my Mandarin Chinese fluency, even though it was the first language that I learned. I can barely speak it now, in compared to English, which is my main language right now. So yeah, there's actually a lot of things that kind of I feel like are really important to talk about. And especially in the context of cultural appropriation, you know, there are a lot of different aspects that are appropriated from each culture that people might not even understand, right? That can be like boba, right? Because boba was invented in Taiwan. A lot of people don't know that. And I think a big issue is that there is a large aggregation, right? Like what Irene was talking about earlier, Asian as a monolith, right? It's not even Asian, right? Because people don't want to acknowledge this pan label of Asian. They kind of just want to say you're Chinese, right? Or like Chinese is kind of like the all-encompassing term I find as well. And especially in the case with Taiwanese politics right now, that's a great question. Honestly, the right name is boba, because the correct say to say is boba, right? Boba, and that is a large tapioca ball. That's what it is, right? So when you say like I want to go get boba, right? It just means that I want to go get boba, or like go get that specific drink, right, with boba in it or whatever. But yeah, so a lot of people say that like boba is Chinese, right? Or that the Lantern Festival is Chinese, right? But like a lot of these different like lantern festivities or specific drinks, right, of boba, right? Like taro or ube, right? Drinks, right? These come from different specific regions in Asia that you can't just single out to like some kind of specific region, right? And to single it out in that way, I think is incredibly dismissive and disrespectful. And I think that a big issue in Utah right now is kind of this constant, it seems like they're having a lantern festival like every 2-3 months, but like that completely ruins the point and it completely messes up the environment too. Like I know that there are people that go out after these festivals to go and collect these lanterns, but that doesn't matter. But at least in my culture, sending lanterns is something very significant, right? And it's only done at very certain times, right? And so just to say, oh, we want to see pretty lights in the sky, and just limit it to something like that, you know, I think is really whack. And yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say on this slide. So cool. Jumping straight into it. So this is a picture of a Woods Cross yeah, so this is a picture of Woods Cross prom. And this is a picture from a viral tweet that I made. And this is actually one of the first video panels I've spoken on about this issue. So this is a D.I.V.A exclusive right here. And I think, you know, we mentioned it previously, but if you can see here, Kenzie, I believe that's her name, is wearing a cheap Hal. And she has absolutely no idea what it is. It's just a pretty dress to her, right? But, you know, yeah, Emilio, I don't travel, but it probably is bubble tea in East Coast. So I bet it's pretty localized to the Asian American communities around there. But yeah, it's Kazaya. That's right. It's Kazaya. So I think so, at least from what a lot of people said, right? This is kind of like a pose from some kind of popular YouTuber called H3H3, right? That wasn't specifically meant to mock Asian Americans, right? Even if you believe that, I think the complete ignorance of like putting the two together is really stupid. Or really just, I was not verified. I was not verified. And yeah, she also got a lot more followers than me, but it's fine. Yeah, so the wearing of the chipao without knowing any kind of background behind the dress, as well as any kind of like historical knowledge about Asian American culture, and just kind of finding it at a secondhand store and saying, hey, this looks nice. Maybe I'll wear it to prom, right? And people will think that I look exotic. People will think that I look good, right? But I think the biggest thing for me is if I were to wear my cultural clothing at prom at any other time other than like a cultural festival, I would have been mocked. Like, how come this person can wear, why can Kazaya, a white person who is not involved in my culture at all, wear a piece of my cultural clothing and not and be valorized for it? Whereas if I were to wear my own piece of cultural clothing, you know, I would be seen as other. I would be othering myself, right? I would be oppressing myself. I would be isolating myself, right? As a, you know, as a foreigner, most definitely. So I think that, yeah, I think that the complete ignorance here is one that is not, what's the word? I think it's past the realm of saying, oh, I didn't think about this, because I think that there is at least a sentiment of it, yes, especially with the pose, right? The two combined makes it seem very intentional. So we can move on to the next one too. And then in response to the tweet, you know, I actually got a lot of death threats. My family, you know, people also found my family, you know, through looking up my name. And I think the most ironic thing is that people would go on and threaten them and like question them, and they would ask, and they would make death threats to me, you know, of physical violence, and just say stuff like, hey, like, why are you taking this so seriously? But it's ironic because they're going through the lengths of threatening me and my family, you know? So I would consider that to be another connection to like white fragility and white tears there, right? They're so insecure about their standing and position in the like racial hierarchy or like whatever kind of power dynamics exist, that like they feel like they need to physically threaten me, right? Or my family, in order to maintain some sort of sense of power. Yes. Oh, can we go back to the previous slide too? Sorry. Yes, and as you can see, something that I really wanted to point out that I thought was important is that this idea of painting Asian American men in this context, or Asian men, as a threat to white women has been a historical pattern, right? So as you can see, this picture is from 1899 during the peak of the Yellow Peril, which is kind of a wave of anti-Asian sentiment, especially in California, after a bunch of Chinese and Japanese people came to San Francisco to mine gold. So, so this is just one of the few tweets, but I think that like a picture was painted of me as like attacking this white woman, or like being a danger to this white woman, or bullying a white woman, right? And I think that is a very clear, yes, exactly, Emilio, yeah. So the first major immigration act was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that was the first major immigration act ever implemented by the United States. But yeah, like, and in response, right, to the kind of this villainization of Asian American men, right, also came the emasculation of Asian American men as well, right, where, you know, Asian men are seen as like frail, weak, silent, right, not masculine, right? That's why you don't see their representation in media. You don't see them getting lead roles, right? Especially in at least in the past, in things like superhero films, or right, or ones with like strong like strong lead roles. So that's kind of never been a thing. And I think that at least from what I can see, the media landscape is changing a little bit now, but it kind of creates a really weird dynamic, especially for myself, right? Because I don't buy into masculinity, right? Yeah, I personally am not someone that buys into masculinity, right? I don't believe in hypermasculinity or masculine things, but I am still mad about being emasculated, right? So it really creates this like really huge internal conflict in my head where it's like, why am I getting mad about something that I don't even believe in, right? But so I think it's a really important note that even though that, you know, even though that we are emasculated in the sense of, you know, being seen as weak, frail, unattractive, you know, at least compared to the white man, right? I don't think that that necessarily means that we want to be the white man, right? Or the at least stereotypical traditional white man. And I think that that's also probably a cultural thing as well. So yeah, we can go on to the next slide now. All of the other speakers, they did a great job, and we've kind of touched on this a few times already, but I think that a biggest thing is that, you know, proximity matters, right? So a lot of the responses to that tweet is like, oh, we love seeing this cultural appreciation, right? Not appropriation, but it's because they exist in a space where the American power dynamics don't exist, right? Where you know, where they're, because they don't exist in a white space, whereas we are constantly battling a white space, right? So they could, it's hard for Asians specifically to understand the struggles of Asian Americans, at least from my perspective. So yeah, that's pretty much that slide. This is just more of the same thing. Yeah. And yeah, go ahead and play it, and then we can talk about it after.
High school student is responding to worldwide backlash after she posted prom pictures to Twitter over the weekend. The senior's choice of a traditional Chinese dress is what sparked this whole controversy. News specialist Caitlin Burchell spoke to her today.
This isn't cultural appropriation. This is cultural appreciation.
18-year-old Keziah Dom says she was in search of a modest dress to wear to prom.
I just saw the dress and immediately was like, this is the dress. I thought it was gorgeous, and I wore it to the dance, and I got so many compliments from people I didn't even know.
But her choice has received a lot of negative attention worldwide after someone retweeted her post, writing, "My culture is not your expletive prom dress." So far, it's received nearly 42,000 retweets, 180,000 likes, and the comments keep on coming.
I guess some might have taken it the wrong way and called out cultural appropriation. And it definitely wasn't, because my whole intent was to show my appreciation and love for the culture.
This post amongst friends is garnering online angst too.
That was in reference to a YouTube channel called H3H3 Productions, where they have these little poses, which is Papa Praise and Babe Nation, and it was nothing racist or demeaning towards them at all.
Dom says even with all the negative reactions she's received, there are even more people who stand by her decision, including folks from China.
South China Morning Post, and they were basically showing their support and how they were proud that I would be willing to wear one of their dresses to my prom.
The teen does regret initially responding to haters with some harsh language in the immediate stress of the backlash, but she stands by her dress decision. Would you pick the dress again?
Yes, for sure. I would wear it again to other dances. I think it's a very beautiful dress that represents some good meaning to it.
Caitlin Burchell, KSL 5 News. Caitlin, thank you. So where is the line between representing a culture and appropriating it? We asked a professor at the U who studies these kinds of issues.
The danger with the cultural appropriation is it doesn't matter if your intention is good or not good, or I didn't mean to harm anyone, I didn't mean to make anyone angry. It's it's that it leads to stereotyping.
Maya Ota there also says the most important way to learn the difference is to read all the different perspectives and really understand how an item is used in that particular culture.
Cool. So, well, watching that video grinds my gears pretty much every time. Yeah, I'm ready to take a nap, I think. But yeah, no, it's really infuriating because it's kind of like they kind of paint me, right, without saying me specifically, as kind of the enemy here, right? In the sense that the rhetoric that they use is very kind of telling in that, you know, they brought up South China Morning Post without kind of bringing up this issue of proximity, right? They're saying, oh, even Chinese people think that's okay, right? Like, sorry, I don't give a shit what Chinese people think, honestly. I give a shit what Chinese American people think, right? I care about, you know, how you know, people in my community feel about this, right? My family, right? And I think the biggest teller too is like when Keziah is saying, you know, yeah, this was a beautiful dress, you know, and you know, I got a lot of compliments on it, right? That just ties straight back to exactly what I was saying, right? Like, if I wore this at prom, how many people would have said it was beautiful, right? Like straight up, like would I've gotten mocked? I would. The fact that I can't sum up the confidence to wear something like that at prom, I think also entails a lot of like social pressures, right? That obviously white people don't have, right? And so, yeah, and because I said it's a fucking dress. It is not a fucking dress. It's a piece of history. It's a piece of culture. It's important to us, right? It's what we, you know, what else can we hold on to here, right? What else does this white space give us to keep, right? What can be ours? What is something that isn't going to be co-opted by corporation? What is something that is not going to be co-opted by white culture, right? Like, we don't, and here's the thing, we don't want a melting pot, because a melting pot means that you get to take whatever we bring, right? Whatever ingredients we bring, right? You get to dissolve that, right? You get to dissolve all of that and make it yours, right? We want to maintain our own structures, right? And we're more than happy to bring you in to help you appreciate and help you learn about it, right? In fact, a lot of people, you know, a lot of people live for that, right? Like, that is their full-time, you know, job, you know, that's something that they're passionate about, is teaching people about their culture. And I think that's amazing, right? But there's a fine line, right? Like, you're right, at least the way I see it, Keziah isn't coming in and learning, she is breaking in and taking, right? And yeah, it's imperialistic, it's the colonist mentality that I think a lot of people don't really think about. And yeah, that's all I have for that slide, I think. Oh, cool. So this is the another model minority slide that I kind of want to talk about. So as you know, Irene especially mentioned the theory of triangulation, where, you know, we are literally, where kind of this propping up of Asian Americans is used as a wedge, right, to drive POC apart. Yeah. I think it'd also be good for everybody to pitch in here. And these are just some quotes. I don't really feel comfortable reading them, but I'm sure that y'all can read them yourselves. But these are some quotes pulled from, the former consul of Japan in 1879, right? And these quotes kind of show that, right, pretty much as soon as the Chinese started flooding in and Asians started flooding into the United States, immediate comparisons were made between Asians, Asian Americans, and the Black and Brown communities. So I think that the fact that this immediate comparison is made, right, really shows that it's that kind of this myth of the model minority is kind of used as a strategy, right, to fracture people of color and communities of color, right? And in high school, I think I kind of witnessed this clash the most because I held a lot of, or I did a lot of things wrong in high school and middle school, right? And I held a lot of wrong misconceptions, right? And a lot of people held wrong misconceptions about me. And I think one of the most prevalent examples, right, is having people assume that I was always good at math, right? Or that I was always going to be good at school. And they're like, and it was, well, you're good at school because you're Asian, right? And it's more like, no, I'm good at school because I busted my ass. Like, it has nothing to do with my race. I'm sure that I gain a lot of racial privilege, to some extent, right? But, I don't really have much more to say about this aspect, but I do want to say that the model minority myth is not, it is not solely something beneficial. A lot of people think that there's such a thing as a positive stereotype, right? Oh, it's good that people think that Asians are smart, right? Right? Why is that a bad thing, right? But the thing is, this leads to a lack of resources and a lack of critical introspection, right, when it comes to the Asian American demographic, right? To be more specific, right, like a lot of people bring up the statistic that Asian Americans make more money than any other demographic, right? So they're like, oh, how can there be white privilege if Asian Americans are making more than white people on average, right? But the thing is, they fail to look at the specific Asian American subgroups, right? Like, for example, Vietnamese people, right? Vietnamese people on average have a lower college education attainment rate than white people. Similarly, there's a higher concentration of Vietnamese people in service jobs and blue collar jobs, right? Even though the proportions of educational attainment are relatively higher in terms of how that ratio works. Similarly, when it comes to Asian American men, they're seen as one of the highest earners, but from a recent study, I can include all my sources too if y'all want those later, but in a recent study, they found that when you look at Asian American men with low educational attainment, they make significantly less than white men of the same education level. So it's very, I think, there's no such thing as a positive stereotype, because you're holding people to a standard that they realistically can't achieve because they don't have the resources, because people think that they don't need them, right? I think a big example is like educational resources for Hmong people, right? Shout out to Suni Lee, by the way, killing it out there. But yeah, yes, Emilio, if you could bring up the LA riots, that would be amazing. That would be super cool. So
Yeah, sorry, can y'all hear me? Okay. So yeah, I think just one of the more prevalent examples for model minority and then racial triangulation theory, right, is that in LA riots, right, after the decision over like the judge's decision over Rodney King and who's going to be held responsible if the white police officers were going to be subject to, you know, to being held accountable for police brutality, et cetera, et cetera. You know, during the same time they were covering that, a lot of the news stations, in fear that there would be right racial retribution against white people because of the ethnic backgrounds of the cops, were also showing at the same time police store owner. Not, and this isn't to say right like the anti-blackness doesn't exist within Asian American communities, but like they were showing, you know, a Korean store owner shooting, I think it was a black girl, for attempting to steal in their store, and so during the time at the times of the Rodney King trials, they were also showing that, right, and so that that white businesses or that white neighborhoods wouldn't be affected. So then instead, right, it kind of boiled down not just to Asian Americans but to the Korean community and the Black community at odds with each other over, you know, mourning and all this stuff. So yeah, that's one of the examples. And in addition to what Jeremy was saying earlier about the statistics, right? It's saying Asian Americans are overall the most highly, what is it called? Most highly successful because they have high household incomes, but they're not also accounting that our household incomes are a combination of multiple generations of income and more than just one income earner, versus perhaps like white families who are more likely to be to live in single family households. Asian Americans are most likely to live in multi-generational, multi-family, multi-unit households with several income earners, which shows that like, yeah, maybe we're making more than white Americans, but it doesn't take that into account that actually because there are more income earners in the house living in low income situations. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Amelia. That's a really good point. And yeah, I just wanted to quickly add something that I forgot to mention in my slide on model minority too. Something that was actually really interesting that I realized recently was that growing up in Boise, Idaho, it was a lot of competition between, I went to a high school that was essentially a college prep school. It was really good education, but the Asians in that school were, I mean, statistically speaking, I felt like we were really competing with each other to become like the best performing or whatever. And really that, when you think about it, like we were really trying to vie for spots that were meant for white students. So inherently, like becoming the best performing Asian was so that we could take these spots that really weren't even supposedly like meant for us. And that's really what's sad here, is that like we're essentially trying to again cater to the white eye and cater to the white ideal. It's like which one of us is a white person gonna like appreciate more, and this ties to capitalism as well. Which one of us is going to create the most amount of profit? And that's not what life should be about. You know, life should not be about profit. Life should not be about catering to the white man or the white lens or whatever. Like life should be about appreciating who we are as our own existence. And that's something that was really disappointing. And to Amelia's point of like the like clash between the Korean and Black community, that still today like exists, and that is still like a very, very big problem. And back when, well, not back actually, this is very current, like the StopAPIHate movement. I spoke to like some people in the Black and Latinx communities, and they said like, well, our issue matters too. And so it's just like, again, we're not trying to pit against each other. This is not the oppression Olympics. This is not us like trying to vie for a spot that like white people are just entitled to. Like that's not a thing. Like this is our space too. And I think that's something that I really, really want to push here. Like us showing up in these types of spaces and us like raising each other, like we are together and we are raising our issues on a united front. There's no one issue that is more important than the other. We are all equally important and we all deserve recognition and space in the United States of America.
I also wanted to include that like the model minority, just like the belief itself, or even just like the word and like the rhetoric of how it's being used in conversations is actually just anti-Black rhetoric, you know, like people think, so essentially the conversation with it is that like if Black and African American people worked harder or just as hard or were smart like Asians and Americans or Asians and white people were, then they could, you know, take themselves out of poverty or reach the American dream just like Asians were. As if every system in America, from the judicial system to the healthcare system, was not created like to continue to hurt Black and African American communities, you know? America was founded on the exploitation of both indigenous, it was founded on the exploitation and hurt of both indigenous and Black communities. And the American dream, it doesn't exist, nor does the model minority myth. Those are both just, you know, bullshit coin terms that people want to use to pit other, you know, cultural communities together. Like it's not a competition, and it won't work, because I'm always going to want to support my Black brothers and sisters. I'm going to fight with them, you know, I'm not going to, they're not my rival, they're not my competition. And as Diana said, it's not the oppression Olympics, you know, it's just a racial tactic white supremacists use, and we have to learn to identify these harmful tools that are being put to use.
Thank you all so much for sharing your personal narratives with us and pitching on that on this topic. I think that it's super important to cover, especially addressing the distinctions and things that come up between BIPOC communities specifically, unrelated, but always related to white supremacy. We just have to be able to acknowledge that and see how they've crafted these words and stereotypes and ideas to divide us. And it's really sad because we've basically taken them on ourselves now. For example, with the colorism that was implanted by white people, and now we use it to divide our communities. And it's just another strategy. So thank you all for addressing that. It's super important. This is the end of our conversation. We're now opening it up to the audience. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, D.I.V.A is a brave space. So now is the time to ask questions, give us any feedback, and you know, like if there's any pending questions in the back of your mind, this is the time to do it now. We're all here with open ears and open hearts, ready to listen and help you with anything you may need help with. Also, at the end, people always ask how you can continue to support D.I.V.A or support these guest speakers. I always keep it simple and say, put your money where your mouth is. I would like all of our guest speakers to put their Venmos in the chat. I think the best way you can support all of these people, especially since they volunteered to speak and educate you today pro bono, is to send money directly to them. This also doesn't have to be in the form of a one-time payment. You are free to send them money anytime you want. Just to make their day, $5 for a coffee. This work is very tiring. None of us have to sit here and talk about this. I'm sure we'd all actually rather be watching Netflix right now and chilling, but we did take the time to sit here and talk with all of you. Not saying that like we regret it or we don't want to, but put your money where your mouth is. If you do want to support these people, please Venmo them and let's talk. This is like the only time we have to actually engage. So I'm gonna stop sharing and open this up to the audience now. I'm gonna scroll and look at some of the questions I asked throughout this and see if I can get some of y'all's opinions. I guess I have a general question. I guess this one would be for you too, Diana, or anybody else who wants to pitch in. But in watching K-dramas and listening to BTS and like having this infatuation with Korean culture, like where is the line between like appreciation and appropriation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, you know, it's a very fine line. I think it's very easy to just say like, hey, look, I'm learning the culture. I know a lot of people will watch Korean dramas and be like, I'm learning the language. And then they'll go to Korea and kind of claim it their own. So I think it's really important to constantly be critically examining how you're consuming this. And I think it requires a lot of awareness, like consumer, like, oh God, I don't even know if there's a word for this, but like as you, as a consumer, are consuming the media, I think it's really important to be aware of how you're consuming it. So I think a lot of times we'll just be passive in like what we're watching or what we're listening to, but it's really important to, in this case, especially because we're trying to come at this with like a respectful approach, I think it's really important to be cognizant of how we're listening to it, and what we're really taking away from it. If it's like, oh my God, he's cute, I'm gonna watch it and I'm gonna go to Korea to get a Korean boyfriend, which is what I've, like, I'm not joking, this is literally what I've heard so many times. If you're looking to replicate an experience that you have created from your own mind, that inherently is problematic because that is a Western lens. You know, that's not something that is yeah, that is truly respectful of the source. So I think as long as we're respecting Korean culture and we're learning more about the history and we're engaging with the community, we're donating to the community, you know, things like that, then that's respectful. But again, please, as my fellow speaker said, like, I'm not the only one to ask either. Just another thing to keep in mind too is like, you don't just ask one person from the community and be like, they said this, therefore this is truth. Like, you're not done. You have a lot more people to ask. So
very true. Opinions vary. We're planning on doing this meeting this whole series every single year with the new speakers. And I'm sure like every year there's going to be different things that people focus on. And a lot of people are going to have different opinions on like what they think is appropriation, what they think is appreciation, because we're all humans and have our own mind and experiences that craft our opinions. So definitely think checking in with multiple people from that specific background is always the best thing to do. And you'll probably get like 3 or 4 different opinions and then make your decision from there. But I think we've restated this multiple times during the meeting, and it's something that's going to stick with me the most is like, if you have that second thought about it, if you have to ask, just don't do it. Most likely the answer is no, because that's why you're thinking about it. So let's just be respectful and only do things that are appropriate to us, that we don't have to double think about. It's looking like we're not having anybody else from the audience have any questions or comments. Do you, Mayola?
I don't have questions. I just have feedback. I just want to thank all the speakers that put so much time and effort into this. I know how exhausting it is and tiring, but also for you to give me a bunch of perspectives that I wasn't aware of. And being part of this with you guys has been so helpful and appreciated. I love doing this stuff. And I especially appreciate all of you still actively standing up for all people while you're speaking about your cultures, because that's important for us as BIPOC people to stick together, especially in these spaces where, you know, we're talking about our oppression. We can relate to one another. Like, we are all human beings. We just look kind of different. We experience life differently, but there's stuff that we can relate to. And that's what makes us powerful against white supremacy and white supremacists who are actively trying to divide us. It's just really beautiful to see us collectively come together. That's all I have to say.
Perfect. So we're going to wrap it up for the day. Thank you all for giving us 3 hours of your time on a Sunday in Utah. I hope that you all enjoy the rest of the day, kick your feet up, relax, and don't have to take extra time to talk about your trauma for the rest of the week. Thank you so much for being here, and I will be in touch with all of you after this meeting. Goodbye.
Thanks, D.I.V.A.
Of course.